Hello everyone, I am the storyteller and I am here to help you today. I know you use this video to fall asleep, so before that, like the video and subscribe to the channel. Also, where are you from and what time are you watching? Now get comfortable and relax. The neon sign outside the Desert Rose Motel flickers like a dying heartbeat against the endless New Mexico night. Each stutter of pink light casts my reflection in the lobby window, a pale, hollow-eyed stranger I barely recognize anymore. 3 months into this job, and I'm starting to wonder if the desert heat has finally fried what's left of my brain. The clock above the reception desk ticks past midnight, its hands moving with the mechanical persistence of a countdown timer. Highway 285 stretches beyond the glass doors like a black ribbon under stars that seem too bright, too close. The silence out there is absolute, broken only by the occasional rumble of a semi-truck hauling its cargo toward distant cities I'll never see again. I adjust the register log, its pages yellowed and coffee-stained from years of night shift workers like me. The entries are routine. Room 3, couple from Phoenix, paid cash. Room 8, traveling salesman, credit card. Room 12, trucker, cash, checkout, 6 a.m. But then there's room 17, and my pen hovers over the line like it always does. Room 17, daily payment received. Occupied. The handwriting isn't mine. It's not the day manager's either, or the weekend girl who covers my days off. The script is careful, deliberate, written in blue ink that seems to shimmer under the fluorescent lights. When I look closer, the ink appears to move slightly, like water disturbed by an invisible current. A sound drifts through the thin walls, the distant rush of a shower running. Room 17 again. I glance at the key rack behind me and there it hangs, the brass key with its faded plastic tag marked 17. The same key that's been hanging there every night for 3 months, despite the fact that someone is clearly occupying that room. The shower sound stops abruptly, leaving only the hum of the ice machine down the hall and the whisper of wind against the building. Then comes the laughter, soft, melodic, barely audible through the walls. It's the kind of laughter that suggests shared secrets, intimate moments, the comfortable sounds of people who know each other well. But room 17 is at the far end of the building, isolated from the other occupied rooms. I've walked that hallway dozens of times during my rounds, and the door is always locked. Not just locked, it feels sealed, as if something inside is determined to stay hidden. The wood around the frame is swollen with desert moisture, the paint cracked and peeling like sunburned skin. I open the register log again, flipping back through the pages. Every night for the past 3 months, the same entry appears in that careful handwriting. But as I turn the pages, something strange catches my eye. The blue ink in several entries has begun to run, creating thin rivulets down the page. The ink pools and spreads, forming shapes that look almost like dates. My pulse quickens as I study the patterns more carefully. 03/15/2023, 07/22/2023, 11/08/2023. The ink continues to bleed across the paper, forming new combinations of numbers with disturbing precision. Each date seems to pulse with its own rhythm, the ink flowing and reforming as if guided by an unseen hand. I grab my phone and search for the dates online. The first result makes my blood turn cold. Fatal accident on Highway 285, mile marker 47. The date matches perfectly. I check the second date. Multi-vehicle collision, Highway 285, 3 injured. The third, truck rollover, Highway 285, driver hospitalized. Mile marker 47 is less than a quarter mile from the motel. The laughter from room 17 comes again, longer this time, accompanied by the sound of footsteps on linoleum flooring. Heavy footsteps like work boots on a bathroom floor. Then a voice, muffled but distinct, calling my name through the walls. My name. The voice knows my name. I stand up from the desk chair so quickly it rolls backward and slams into the wall. The sound echoes through the empty lobby like a gunshot. My heart pounds against my ribs as I strain to listen for the voice again, but there's only silence now. Even the ice machine has stopped humming. The register log lies open on the desk, and more dates have appeared in bleeding blue ink. 01/12/2024, 04/3/2024, 9/11/2024. Today's date, the ink pools and spreads, and beneath it, new words begin to form in that same careful handwriting. Check room 17. My hands shake as I reach for the master key ring hanging beside the register. The keys jangle together like wind chimes in a storm, each metallic note sharp and discordant in the silence. The key to room 17 feels different from the others, heavier, colder, as if it's been stored in a freezer rather than hanging on a simple hook. The walk down the hallway feels endless. Each step on the worn carpet produces a soft whisper that seems to echo longer than it should. The fluorescent lights overhead flicker intermittently, casting moving shadows that make the walls appear to breathe. The air grows thicker with each step, heavy with the smell of industrial cleaning products and something else. Something sweet and cloying that reminds me of flowers left too long in a vase. Room 17's door stands at the end of the hallway like a monument to secrets. The brass numbers are tarnished black, and the wood around the handle is stained with what looks like years of nervous sweat from countless hands. I press my ear against the door and hold my breath. Silence. Then, from inside the room, comes the soft sound of water dripping. Slow, rhythmic, like a leaky faucet counting down seconds. Between the drops, I hear something else, the rustle of fabric, as if someone is moving around inside, getting dressed or undressed. I knock gently on the door. Hello? This is the front desk. I need to check on the room. The sounds inside stop immediately. The silence that follows is so complete it feels oppressive, as if the air itself has been sucked out of the hallway. Then, from somewhere inside the room, comes my name again. Whispered this time, barely audible, but unmistakably clear. The master key slides into the lock with surprising ease. I turn it slowly, feeling the mechanism click open with a soft, final sound. The door swings inward on its own, revealing a room that should be impossible. The space is larger than any other room in the motel, stretching back farther than the building's exterior walls should allow. Moonlight streams through windows that face directions where no windows should exist, illuminating a space that defies the basic geometry of the structure I've worked in for months. The bathroom door stands ajar, and from within comes the steady drip of water. Steam drifts from the gap like ghostly fingers reaching into the main room. The bed is unmade, its sheets twisted and rumpled as if someone has just vacated it in a hurry. On the nightstand sits a glass of water, half empty, with condensation beating on its surface. I step into the room, and the door closes behind me with a soft click. The sound of the lock engaging makes my stomach lurch, but when I turn to try the handle, it opens easily. The hallway beyond looks normal, unchanged, as if the impossible geometry exists only when I'm looking directly at it. Moving toward the bathroom, I notice personal items scattered around the room. A pair of work boots by the bed, mud still caked on the soles. A wallet on the dresser, worn leather cracked from years of use. Keys on a ring beside it, including what looks like truck keys with a small stuffed animal attached. A tiny bear with one eye missing. The bathroom door creaks as I push it open wider. The shower is running, hot water cascading from the head and filling the small space with steam. Through the frosted glass of the shower door, I can see a silhouette. Tall, broad-shouldered, moving slowly under the spray of water. My voice catches in my throat as I try to speak. "Excuse me? Sir? You need to check out or pay for another night." The figure in the shower turns toward me, and through the distorted glass, I see the outline of a face. It's looking directly at me, though I can't make out any features. One hand presses against the glass from the inside, leaving a perfect handprint in the condensation. I back away from the bathroom, my heart hammering so hard I can feel it in my throat. As I retreat, I catch sight of the wallet on the dresser. It lies open, revealing a driver's license with a photo that makes my blood freeze. The face in the picture is familiar. I've seen it before, in the local newspaper, in missing person posters that went up around town months ago. A truck driver who disappeared somewhere along Highway 285, last seen at a gas station 20 miles south of here. The investigation went cold after weeks of searching empty desert. Behind me, the shower turns off with a sharp squeak of metal against metal. Water continues to drip in the sudden silence, each drop echoing like a hammer strike against porcelain. Footsteps move across the bathroom floor. Wet, heavy steps that leave no prints on the dry linoleum. I grab the wallet and back toward the door, my eyes fixed on the bathroom entrance. The footsteps stop just inside the doorway, and in the silence that follows I hear my name whispered again. Not from the bathroom this time, but from directly behind me. I spin around to find the room empty, but the bed is different now. The sheets are pulled back neatly, as if someone has just gotten out of bed and carefully arranged the covers. On the pillow is a folded piece of paper, motel stationery with the Desert Rose logo. The paper contains a single line of text in that same careful handwriting. "Thank you for checking on me." My hands tremble as I read the words over and over. The ink is still wet, gleaming under the impossible moonlight streaming through windows that shouldn't exist. As I watch, new words begin to appear below the first line, forming with the slow precision of an invisible hand. The others will come soon. They always do. The wallet in my other hand feels heavier now, and when I look down at it, the driver's license photo has changed. The face is different, older, wearing a uniform I recognize. It's the security guard who used to work the night shift here before me, the one who quit suddenly without giving notice, the one no one has seen since. More footsteps echo from the bathroom, joined by others moving through the room. I can't see anyone, but the sounds are unmistakable. Multiple people moving around the space, settling in as if this is their home. Water runs in the sink, faucets turn on and off, and somewhere in the room, that soft laughter begins again. I flee through the door and slam it behind me, my breath coming in sharp gasps that echo through the empty hallway. The key turns in the lock with a grinding sound, as if the mechanism is fighting against me. When I finally hear the click of the deadbolt engaging, I lean against the wall and close my eyes, waiting for my pulse to slow. The walk back to the front desk feels different now. The hallway seems longer, the shadows deeper. Every sound I make, each footstep, each breath, seems to hang in the air longer than it should. Behind me, I hear the soft murmur of voices coming from room 17, conversational and comfortable, as if old friends are catching up after a long separation. Back at the reception desk, I sit down heavily in the chair and stare at the register log. New entries have appeared while I was gone, written in multiple handwritings now. Some entries are in pen, others in pencil, a few in what looks like crayon. Different names, different dates, all for room 17. All marked as daily payment received, occupied. At the bottom of the page, in fresh blue ink that gleams wet under the fluorescent lights, a new message has appeared. Welcome to the night shift. I close the register log and lock it in the desk drawer, but I can still hear the ink moving inside, forming new dates, new messages, new welcomes for guests who will never truly check out. Outside, Highway 285 stretches into darkness, and somewhere in that vast emptiness, another set of headlights approaches the Desert Rose Motel. The neon sign flickers its dying rhythm against the night sky, and I settle back in my chair to wait. In a few hours, the day manager will arrive, and I'll hand over the keys and the register log with its impossible entries. I'll drive home through the morning heat, shower, eat breakfast, and try to sleep. But tonight is not over yet. Tonight, room 17 is occupied, and the voices beyond the walls continue their endless conversation. Tonight, I'm learning what it really means to work the graveyard shift at a motel, where some guests never leave, and others return long after they should have moved on. The clock above my head ticks toward dawn, and somewhere in the distance, I hear the low rumble of another truck approaching on Highway 285. The sound grows louder, closer, and I know that soon I'll hear tires on gravel as another weary traveler pulls into our parking lot, looking for a place to rest. I hope they don't ask for room 17. Story 2. The radio crackled to life at 11:47 p.m., same as every night for the past 3 weeks. Static hissed through the speakers of the ranger station, followed by that voice, my voice, desperate and strained, calling out coordinates that didn't exist on any official map of Yellowstone's backcountry. Help me. Grid reference 77 Delta 9. I'm hurt. Can't move. Please, someone respond. I sat hunched over the radio console, my coffee growing cold as I listened to myself plead into the void. The transmission lasted exactly 43 seconds before dissolving back into white noise. I'd timed it enough times to know. Everything about these calls had become routine, except for the ice-cold dread that crawled up my spine each time I heard my own terror echoing through the darkness. The first night it happened, I'd assumed someone was playing a sick joke. Park rangers deal with pranks, hikers with too much time and amateur radio equipment, kids from the nearby towns testing boundaries. But as I'd sat there, listening to the voice beg for rescue, the hairs on my arms had risen in recognition. That was my cadence, my accent, even the slight rasp I got when I was genuinely afraid. I'd tried responding, keying the microphone and asking who was out there, demanding they identify themselves. Nothing. Just static until the next night, when the same 43-second loop played again. By the third night, I'd started recording the transmissions. By the seventh, I'd played them back enough times to memorize every inflection, every pause between words. By the 14th night, I'd begun to seriously question my own sanity. Tonight marked 21 consecutive transmissions, and I'd finally worked up the nerve to do something I'd been avoiding: plot the coordinates. 77 Delta 9 translated to a location roughly 8 miles northeast of the station, deep in the wilderness where the official trails petered out into game paths and treacherous terrain. The GPS showed it as a blank space between two surveyed areas. Not unusual in itself, but unsettling given the circumstances. I'd been stationed at this remote outpost for 6 years, long enough to know every mapped inch of the surrounding territory. The coordinates pointed to a section of dense forest that butted up against a series of limestone cliffs. Dangerous country, the kind that swallowed unprepared hikers and kept them hidden until spring snowmelt revealed their bones. As the transmission ended, I found myself reaching for my gear before I'd consciously made the decision to investigate. My headlamp, GPS unit, emergency kit, everything I'd need for a night hike into terrain that probably shouldn't be traveled alone. But I had to know. The uncertainty was eating at me from the inside, making me question every shadow, every sound in the darkness beyond the station windows. The October air bit through my jacket as I stepped outside. Above, stars pierced the thin mountain atmosphere with crystal clarity, providing just enough light to navigate the familiar trail that led away from the station. My boots crunched through frost-brittle leaves, each step unnaturally loud in the stillness. I'd hiked these mountains in all seasons, in conditions ranging from pristine to life-threatening. I knew how to read the wilderness, how to sense when something felt wrong. Tonight, everything felt wrong. The normal sounds were absent. No owls calling, no small animals rustling through underbrush, no distant coyotes marking territory. Even the wind seemed muted, as if the forest itself was holding its breath. The GPS led me off the established trail after about 90 minutes of steady climbing. From there, I had to rely on compass bearings and dead reckoning, pushing through stands of lodgepole pine that grew so dense I had to squeeze between trunks. Branches caught at my jacket, and more than once I stumbled over deadfall hidden beneath the carpet of needles. The coordinates brought me to a small clearing surrounded by towering pines. My headlamp beam swept across the open space, illuminating nothing but ordinary forest floor, until it caught something that made my breath catch in my throat. Footprints. Boot prints, to be precise. Fresh ones that hadn't been there long enough for the morning frost to settle in them. I knelt beside the clearest impression, my light revealing every detail of the tread pattern. Vibram sole, size 11, with a distinctive nick near the heel where I'd stepped on a sharp rock during a patrol last month. These weren't just my brand of boots. They were my exact boots, down to every imperfection in the worn rubber. My hands shook as I set my own foot beside the print. Perfect match. But I'd never been to this clearing before. I was certain of that. The terrain, the approach, even the specific arrangement of trees, all of it was completely foreign to me. Yet here were my footprints, leading away from where I crouched and disappearing into the tree line on the clearing's far side. I followed the trail because I couldn't bring myself not to. Each print was perfectly preserved in the soft earth, telling the story of someone, something, that moved with my gait, my stride length, my tendency to favor the left foot slightly due to an old hiking injury. The prints led northwest, toward the limestone cliffs I'd seen marked on the topographical maps. As I tracked them, other details began to emerge. Broken branches at shoulder height, where someone had pushed through dense growth. Scuff marks on rocks where boots had slipped slightly before finding purchase. Even the occasional thread from a jacket caught on thorns. Dark green fabric that matched what I was wearing. The trail wound upward through increasingly difficult terrain. I found myself scrambling over boulder fields and navigating narrow ledges that seemed barely stable enough to support human weight. More than once I paused to catch my breath and noticed how the footprints showed the same hesitation, the same careful testing of unstable rock before committing full weight. It was as if I was following myself on a journey I'd never taken. The climb became more treacherous as I approached the cliff face. Here, the limestone rose in pale sheets that disappeared into darkness above my headlamp's reach. The footprints led right to the base of the cliff, where they ended abruptly at what appeared to be a narrow crevice in the rock. I played my light across the opening. It was barely wide enough for a person to squeeze through, and I couldn't see where it led. The footprints clearly entered the crevice. There were scuff marks on the limestone walls where someone had forced their way inside. Standing at the entrance, I could feel a subtle current of air flowing from within the cliff. The breeze carried a strange smell, something organic and complex that I couldn't identify. Not decay, but something alive and wrong in a way that made my stomach turn. The rational part of my mind screamed warnings. Cave systems were deadly for solo explorers. I didn't have proper equipment, hadn't informed anyone of my location, and had no idea what lay beyond that narrow opening. But the footprints led inside, and I had to know where they went. I squeezed through the crevice, feeling the limestone walls press against my shoulders. After about 10 feet, the passage opened into a larger chamber. My headlamp beam revealed rough walls that curved away into shadows, and I realized I was standing in a natural cave system formed by water erosion over countless centuries. The footprints continued across the cave floor, preserved in deposits of clay and mineral sediment. I followed them deeper into the mountain, through passages that branched and merged in ways that would be impossible to map without proper surveying equipment. The air grew colder as I descended, and that strange organic smell grew stronger. After what felt like hours of careful navigation, I emerged into a chamber large enough that my headlamp couldn't find the far walls. The footprints led to the center of the space, where they simply stopped. No body, no equipment, no signs of a struggle or collapse. Just footprints that ended as abruptly as if their maker had vanished mid-step. I stood in that vast underground space, my light inadequate against the pressing darkness, and felt the full weight of impossibility settling around me. The person who had made these tracks, who had spoken in my voice over the radio, had walked into this chamber and disappeared. As I turned to leave, my light caught something I'd missed on the way in, carved into the limestone wall near the chamber entrance. Barely visible unless viewed from just the right angle, were words scratched deep into the rock. "I'm already here." The letters were fresh, cut through mineral deposits that would have taken decades to accumulate, and below them, pressed into the soft cave clay like a signature, was a single handprint. My handprint. I ran from that chamber, stumbling through passages that seemed to shift and change in my headlamp's uncertain glow. Twice I took wrong turns that led to dead ends I didn't remember passing on the way in. The cave system seemed larger on the way out, as if it was expanding around me, keeping me trapped in its stone embrace. When I finally burst through the crevice entrance into the cold mountain air, dawn was breaking over the eastern peaks. I'd been underground for over 6 hours, though it had felt like minutes. My GPS showed the same coordinates the radio had been broadcasting, 77 Delta 9. The hike back to the ranger station passed in a blur of exhaustion and growing paranoia. Every shadow seemed to hide watching eyes. Every sound made me spin around, expecting to see myself emerging from the tree line. By the time I reached the familiar safety of the station, I was jumping at my own footsteps. I tried to convince myself it had all been some kind of hallucination brought on by stress and sleep deprivation. The isolation of the job, the endless weeks without human contact, the repetitive nature of the radio transmissions, All of it could have combined to create an elaborate psychological break from reality. But that night, at exactly 11:47 p.m., my radio crackled to life again. "Help me. Grid reference 77 Delta 9. I'm hurt. Can't move. Please." Someone respond. The same message, the same coordinates, the same desperate voice that sounded exactly like mine, but now I could hear something I'd missed before. A subtle echo in the background, as if the words were being spoken in a vast underground chamber. I keyed the microphone with trembling hands, and finally responded to myself. "I hear you. I'm coming." The transmission cut to static, but not before I heard something that made my blood freeze in my veins. Laughter. My laughter, echoing from somewhere deep beneath the earth. Since that night, I've made the journey to 77 Delta 917 more times. Each trip reveals new footprints leading away from the cave, always in a different direction. Always toward areas of the map marked only as wilderness, places where the trails end and the survey lines fade into white space. I follow them because I have to, because somewhere out there in the Wyoming wilderness, there are versions of myself walking paths I've never taken, calling for help I can't provide, leaving signs that lead nowhere and everywhere at once. The radio still broadcasts at 11:47 p.m. every night. Sometimes it's my voice calling from the coordinates. Other times, it's my voice responding, promising help that never comes. And occasionally, when the atmospheric conditions are just right, I can hear multiple versions of myself having conversations that make no sense, discussing places that don't exist and events that never happened. I don't know if I'm losing my mind or if something in those caves has torn holes in the fabric of what's real. I only know that every night, I wait for that radio transmission, and every morning, I find new footprints leading deeper into the wilderness. Tonight, the GPS shows a new set of coordinates. The voice on the radio sounds tired, defeated, but still unmistakably mine. And somewhere out in the darkness beyond my station windows, I know there are fresh footprints waiting to be discovered, leading toward a destination I'm afraid to reach, but powerless to avoid. The mountains keep their secrets well, but some secrets have a way of keeping you instead. Story 3. The heat shimmer rose from the cracked asphalt like ghostly fingers reaching for something that would never come. 15 years behind the wheel of my 18-wheeler had taught me to read the desert's moods, but this stretch of Nevada felt different. Wrong somehow, as if the very air had grown thick with secrets it couldn't quite contain. I'd been driving the loneliest road in America for the better part of a decade, hauling freight between Reno and Salt Lake City, but I'd never stopped in Belmont before. The town appeared in my windshield like a mirage that refused to dissolve, its weathered buildings standing sentinel against the endless expanse of sage and sand. Most ghost towns in Nevada were nothing more than foundations and rusty machinery, but Belmont seemed to hover in that liminal space between existence and memory. The engine's diesel rumble echoed off the empty storefronts as I downshifted through what had once been Main Street. Dust devils danced between the skeletal remains of a saloon and a general store whose windows stared out like hollow eyes. I wasn't planning to stop. Fuel gauge still showed a quarter tank, but something made me pull over near the old courthouse. Maybe it was professional curiosity. Maybe it was the way the afternoon light caught the faded lettering on a sign promising cold beer and hot food at a place that had clearly served neither for decades. That's when I saw him. He stood at the edge of town where the pavement surrendered to dirt, one thumb extended toward the road in the universal gesture of hope. Nothing unusual in that. Hitchhikers were common enough on these remote stretches, though most were either college kids seeking adventure or drifters seeking something else entirely. But this one was different. He wore a clean white shirt and pressed khakis, clothes that belonged in an office building rather than a ghost town. His dark hair was perfectly combed, his shoes unscuffed by desert dust. I'd sworn off picking up strangers years ago after a close call with a meth head outside Ely, but something about this man's stillness, his patient way of waiting, made me reconsider. Besides, The empty road stretched endlessly ahead, and the radio had been crackling nothing but static for the past 50 miles. Company might be welcome. I pulled the rig to a stop and leaned across to open the passenger door. The man climbed up with surprising agility, settling into the seat with a small nod of gratitude. Up close, I could see he was younger than I'd first thought. Maybe 35, with pale skin that seemed untouched by the harsh desert sun. "Appreciate the ride," he said, his voice carrying a slight accent I couldn't quite place. "Names? Well, you can call me Tom." The hesitation was so brief I almost missed it, but 15 years of reading people at truck stops and way stations had sharpened my instincts. Still, I introduced myself and pulled back onto the highway, grateful for the company despite the odd formality of his speech. Tom proved to be an engaging conversationalist. He spoke knowledgeably about the history of the region, the silver mines that had briefly made Belmont prosperous, the railroad that had passed it by, the slow death that claimed most Nevada boomtowns. His observations were precise, almost scholarly, and delivered in that same careful tone that suggested English wasn't his first language, though he spoke it flawlessly. "This road has seen more than its share of tragedy," he commented as we passed a makeshift memorial, where crosses and faded flowers marked some long-ago accident. "People disappear out here. Sometimes they're found, sometimes they're not. Sometimes they're found, but they're different." I glanced over at him, but his attention seemed focused on the endless sage outside the passenger window. In the side mirror, I could see the memorial shrinking behind us, but something bothered me about the reflection. It took a moment to realize what. The passenger seat appeared empty in the mirror's frame. I blinked hard, attributing the optical illusion to road fatigue and the heat shimmer that made everything beyond the windshield waver like water. When I looked again, the mirror showed exactly what it should: Tom's profile as he gazed out at the desert. "You from around here?" I asked, partly to distract myself from the growing unease that had settled in my chest like cold stones. "I've been here longer than most would believe," he replied, and something in his tone suggested layers of meaning I couldn't quite grasp. "Long enough to know this road's moods, its hungers." The word hungers sent an involuntary shiver down my spine. I'd driven through every kind of weather, every time of day and night, but I'd never thought of a road as having appetites. Still, there was something about US 50 that did seem almost alive. The way it stretched endlessly toward horizons that never seemed to get closer. The way it drew travelers into its emptiness and sometimes simply swallowed them. We drove in companionable silence for the next 20 miles. The only sounds the diesel's steady rhythm and the whisper of wind around the cab. The sun had begun its descent toward the western mountains, painting the landscape in shades of amber and rust. I'd need to stop for fuel soon, and dinner wouldn't be unwelcome either. The Crossroads truck stop appeared like an oasis in the growing dusk, its neon signs promising diesel, food, and lodging. It was one of the last full-service stops before Austin, Nevada, and I'd eaten there many times over the years. The owner, a weathered man everyone called Hank, served decent coffee and knew enough to mind his own business. I pulled into the fuel island and shut down the engine. The sudden silence felt profound after hours of road noise, broken only by the settling sounds of cooling metal and the distant hum of the truck stop's generators. "You hungry?" I asked Tom as I gathered my wallet and logbook. He nodded but said nothing, following me across the gravel lot toward the diner's entrance. The electric bell chimed our arrival, and Hank looked up from behind the counter with his usual nod of recognition. The place was nearly empty. Just a couple of local ranchers nursing coffee at the far end, and a travel-worn family with out-of-state plates picking at plates of chicken-fried steak. We took a booth near the window, and Tom studied the laminated menu with intense concentration, as if the choice between a hamburger and a chicken sandwich carried cosmic significance. When the waitress arrived, a middle-aged woman with tired eyes and comfortable shoes, I ordered my usual coffee, apple pie, and the meatloaf special. Tom requested the same, adding only that he preferred his coffee black. The conversation during dinner remained pleasant, but somehow insubstantial. Tom spoke about the desert's geology, the migration patterns of sage grouse, the peculiar way sound carried in the dry air. His knowledge seemed encyclopedic, yet strangely impersonal, as if he were reciting information rather than sharing experiences. I found myself watching his hands as he spoke, pale, long-fingered, with nails that seemed almost translucent in the diner's fluorescent lighting. It wasn't until I stood to pay the check that I noticed the first real strangeness. The mirror behind the cash register reflected the entire diner, the ranchers, the traveling family, myself standing at the counter. But Tom's booth appeared empty. Not vacant exactly, but as if the space itself had been edited out of the reflection. I paid quickly, my hands shaking slightly as I counted out bills. Hank's receipt showed charges for 2 complete meals, 2 slices of pie, and 4 cups of coffee. When I glanced back at our booth, Tom was finishing the last of his pie, apparently oblivious to my growing discomfort. "Everything all right?" Hank asked, following my gaze toward the booth. "Fine," I managed. "Just tired. Long day." But Hank's expression suggested something else entirely. His weathered face creased with concern as he looked from me to the booth and back again. "You feeling okay, friend? You seem a little distracted." The way he said it, the careful tone, made me realize he couldn't see Tom at all. The thought hit me like a physical blow, leaving me breathless and slightly dizzy. I mumbled something about the heat and hurried back to the booth, where Tom was waiting with that same patient expression he'd worn in Belmont. We returned to the truck in silence, the evening air carrying the scent of sage and distant rain. As I performed my pre-trip inspection, checking lights and tire pressure, I found myself stealing glances at Tom. He stood perfectly still beside the passenger door, hands clasped behind his back, gazing up at the first stars appearing in the darkening sky. Back on the road, the dashboard lights cast everything in an eerie green glow. The radio, which had been silent for most of the afternoon, suddenly crackled to life. Static filled the cab, then cleared to reveal a woman's voice. Soft, familiar, impossible. "Don't go any further on the 50, the voice said, and my blood turned to ice water in my veins. "Please, honey, turn around. Come home." It was Elena's voice, my wife's voice. Elena, who had been dead for 3 years, her ashes scattered from the Golden Gate Bridge on a foggy San Francisco morning. Elena, whose last words to me had been spoken from a hospital bed, her hand in mine. Her voice barely a whisper as the cancer finally claimed what it had been stalking for months. I jerked the wheel slightly, and the truck drifted toward the shoulder before I regained control. Tom turned to look at me, his pale face reflecting the dashboard lights like phosphorescence. "You heard it too," he said, and it wasn't a question. "That's impossible." My voice sounded foreign to my own ears, tight with fear and disbelief. "She's been gone for 3 years. Death isn't always the end of a journey," Tom replied quietly. "Sometimes it's just a different kind of beginning. Sometimes the dead have urgent business with the living." The radio crackled again, and Elena's voice returned, clearer now but edged with desperation. "The road ahead isn't safe. There are things waiting in the darkness between the towns, things that feed on travelers who venture too far from the world they know." My hands trembled on the steering wheel. Every rational part of my mind insisted this was impossible. A hallucination brought on by stress, isolation, too many years of endless highways and sleepless nights. But the voice was unmistakably hers, carrying that slight Spanish accent she'd never quite lost. The way she pronounced my name like a prayer. "What are you?" I whispered to Tom, but he had turned his attention back to the window, watching the darkness that pressed against the glass like something alive and hungry. "I'm someone who's been where you're going," he said finally. "Someone who learned too late that some roads don't lead to destinations. They lead to transformations." The mile markers flew past like tombstones, each one marking our progress deeper into the heart of nothing. The radio continued its impossible broadcast, Elena's voice pleading with me to turn back, to leave this road before it was too late. But too late for what? And how could I trust a voice that belonged to someone 3 years dead? I thought about stopping, pulling over until dawn, waiting for daylight to restore some semblance of normalcy to the world. But truck stops were few and far between on this stretch. and the darkness beyond the headlights seemed to pulse with its own malevolent life. Forward seemed as dangerous as backward, and standing still felt like surrender to whatever waited in the spaces between heartbeats. Tom began to speak again, his voice barely audible above the engine's rumble. He told me about travelers who had ventured too far into the desert's embrace, about the way the road could change people, drawing them away from their old lives and into something altogether different. His words painted pictures of transformation that weren't entirely unpleasant. Freedom from the weight of memory, release from the gravity of loss, a kind of peace found only in motion. The desert has always been a place of visions, he said. Native peoples came here to seek their spirits, to find truths hidden in the emptiness. Sometimes those truths require a certain letting go. As he spoke, I began to notice changes in the landscape. The familiar markers, rock formations, exit signs, the distant lights of scattered ranches seemed to be disappearing, replaced by terrain I didn't recognize. The road itself felt different beneath the tires, smoother somehow, as if it were newer than the cracked asphalt I remembered from countless previous trips. The radio fell silent, leaving only the sound of the engine and Tom's quiet breathing. Or what I assumed was breathing. When I glanced over at him, his chest didn't seem to be moving at all. In the side mirror, the passenger seat remained stubbornly empty, a fact I was becoming less and less able to ignore. "Where exactly are we going?" I asked, my voice tight with a fear I couldn't quite name. "Nowhere special," Tom replied. "Nowhere at all, really. That's the beauty of it. When you're nowhere, you can be anyone. When you've left the world behind, the world can't hurt you anymore." The speedometer showed 65, but the sensation of movement had become strangely abstract. The yellow lines beneath us seemed to stretch into infinity, and the darkness beyond the headlights had taken on a quality of absolute depth, as if we were traveling not across the desert but through it, into spaces that existed between the atoms of ordinary reality. Elena's voice returned one final time, fainter now, as if transmitted across an impossible distance. "I love you," she whispered through the static, "but you have to choose, the road or the memory, movement or meaning. You can't carry both much further." I realized then that I'd been driving toward this moment for 3 years, ever since that hospital room, ever since the funeral that felt like watching my own life being lowered into the ground. The endless highways, the constant motion, the way I'd structured my life around being between places rather than in them. It had all been leading to this choice. The truck's headlights carved a tunnel through the darkness ahead, and for the first time in years, I couldn't see where it ended. Tom sat beside me like a patient guardian, waiting for my decision with the infinite stillness of someone who had already made his own choice long ago. Behind us, fading into distance and memory, lay everything I had known. Ahead waited the possibility of transformation, of becoming something that existed purely in motion, freed from the weight of loss and the burden of remembering. The radio hummed with static that might have been Elena's voice, or might have been the sound of the universe slowly unwinding. I pressed the accelerator a little harder, and the darkness swallowed us completely. Whether I was driving toward salvation or damnation, I no longer knew. But for the first time in 3 years, the distinction didn't seem to matter. The road stretched ahead like a promise, and I followed it into whatever waited beyond the last mile marker, beyond the final exit, beyond the place where highways ended and something else entirely began. The truck's engine hummed its familiar song, but everything else had changed. Or perhaps, after 15 years of running from the same persistent ghosts, I was finally ready to join them in their eternal journey through the spaces between destinations. In the side mirror, even my own reflection was beginning to fade. Story 4. The fluorescent lights in Eastwood Commons never quite died. Even after 3 years of abandonment, they flickered with the persistence of dying insects, casting erratic shadows across cracked tile floors and empty storefronts. I'd been working security here for 8 months now, protecting what the property management company called valuable assets, though I suspected they meant the copper wiring and whatever retail fixtures the scavengers hadn't claimed yet. My shift started at 11 p.m. and ended at 7 a.m. 8 hours alone in a mall that once bustled with suburban families and teenagers, now reduced to echoing footsteps and the mechanical wheeze of an HVAC system running on autopilot. The pay was decent for essentially doing nothing, and after my last job ended badly, I needed the solitude. At least, that's what I told myself. The first thing I noticed wasn't the cold drafts that seemed to blow from nowhere, or the way my footsteps echoed differently depending on which wing I patrolled. It was the directory, the mall map, mounted in its glass case near what used to be the food court, showed stores that had never existed. I'd studied the layout during my first week, memorizing exit routes and checking every unit number against the clipboard Mrs. Chen had given me. But sometime during my third week, I noticed new stores appearing on the map. Temporal Threads, where the old Radio Shack used to be. Yesterday's Tomorrow, in place of the defunct jewelry store. Memory Lane Antiques, occupying a space that had been empty since before the mall closed. I assumed maintenance had updated it as part of some renovation planning, but when I called the property management office, Mrs. Chen insisted no changes had been made to any signage. The directory was original, she said, dating back to the mall's opening in 1987. When I described the stores I was seeing, her voice took on a brittle edge. "You've been working too many hours," she said. "Maybe take a personal day." But I couldn't afford personal days, and besides, the job was easy enough. Walk the corridors, check the doors, write a report. Nothing complicated about it. Nothing that should have made my hand shake when I wrote the date at the top of each incident log. The escalators had been shut down since the mall closed, their metal steps frozen in place like teeth in a permanent grimace. But they still hummed with residual electricity, a low vibration that seemed to pulse through the building's bones. I'd grown accustomed to the sound during my rounds, the way it mixed with the distant rumble of traffic on Interstate 71 and the occasional settling groan of the building itself. It was during my 5th week that I first heard them moving. The sound was subtle at first, a mechanical clicking, like gears engaging after years of disuse. I was in the East Wing, checking the service doors near what used to be J.C. Penney, when the noise drifted down the corridor. By the time I reached the main concourse, the escalators had stopped, but something about their position seemed wrong. The steps appeared to be facing the opposite direction, as if they'd been running backwards. I stood there for nearly 10 minutes, staring at the motionless machinery and trying to convince myself that I'd simply misremembered their orientation. Stress could do strange things to perception, I knew. I'd learned that lesson the hard way at my previous job, before the incident that made me unemployable at any reputable security firm. My watch read 3:34 a.m. The next night, I made sure to check the escalators at exactly 3:30. I positioned myself near the fountain, a circular concrete basin that had been drained years ago, but still smelled faintly of chlorine and pennies. From there, I had a clear view of both escalators and could monitor my watch without taking my eyes off them. 3:31. Nothing. 3:32. The humming grew slightly louder, though that could have been my imagination. 3:33. The escalators shuddered to life. They moved slowly at first, their steps descending when they should have been ascending when they should have been descending. The motion was silent except for the whisper of metal against metal, and it lasted exactly 60 seconds. At 3:34, they stopped, returning to their usual dormant state. I approached cautiously, my flashlight beam dancing across the frozen steps. Everything appeared normal. The same scratched metal, the same safety warnings in faded print, the same sense of mechanical death that had characterized them since my first day. But I couldn't shake the feeling that something fundamental had changed, that the building itself had shifted in some imperceptible way. The lost and found was a small office behind the customer service desk, filled with cardboard boxes containing the detritus of 3 years' worth of abandonment. During my first week, I'd inventoried the contents out of boredom: mismatched gloves, expired makeup, a single flip-flop, countless hair ties, and forgotten earrings. The usual archaeological remains of consumer culture. But items kept appearing. At first, I attributed it to incomplete record keeping. Maybe I'd missed something during my initial inventory, or perhaps other security guards had been depositing items they'd found during their shifts. The property management company had been vague about previous security personnel, mentioning only that turnover was high and that I shouldn't expect to find detailed logs from my predecessors. The first item I recognized was a leather wallet, brown and worn at the edges. I found it sitting on top of a box of unclaimed cell phones, as if someone had placed it there deliberately. Inside, I discovered my own driver's license, but the photo showed me with a beard I'd never grown, and the address listed a street I'd never heard of in a city I'd never visited. The expiration date was 3 years in the future. I sat in the security office for an hour, turning the wallet over in my hands and trying to construct a rational explanation. Identity theft, maybe, or an elaborate prank by someone who had access to my personal information. But the leather felt familiar in my hands, worn smooth in places where I imagined my fingers might have rubbed against it over years of use. There was even a coffee stain on one corner that matched the precise shade of the spill I'd made on my kitchen counter that morning. 2 nights later, I found a watch. Silver with a black face, the kind I'd been thinking about buying to replace my current digital model. According to the engraving on the back, it was a gift from someone named Jennifer, commemorating our 5-year anniversary. I'd never dated anyone named Jennifer, but when I held the watch to my ear, its ticking seemed to synchronize with my heartbeat. The items multiplied over the following weeks. A keychain for an apartment I'd never rented, a coffee shop loyalty card with my name printed on it, but punched for a cafe that didn't exist, a parking pass for a university I'd never attended. Each item felt authentic, carrying the weight of use and the patina of familiarity, as if I'd owned them for years. I stopped calling the property management office after Mrs. Chen suggested I might be experiencing job-related stress and perhaps needed to reconsider my career choices. Instead, I began documenting everything, photographing each item, noting the exact time and location of discovery, cross-referencing my findings with my shift reports. The evidence folder grew thick with printouts and notes, but the act of documentation provided a comforting sense of control. The mall began to feel different during those late October weeks. The empty storefronts seemed to watch me as I passed, their dark windows reflecting my flashlight beam in ways that suggested depth where there should have been only concrete walls. The directory continued to update itself, showing new businesses that catered to increasingly specific and disturbing needs. Future Tense Repair Services, the Yesterday Boutique, Temporal Displacement Solutions. I started bringing a small digital camera to work, thinking I could capture proof of the directory changes and perhaps make sense of what was happening. But the photos never showed what I saw with my naked eyes. In the images, the directory displayed only the familiar logos of long-departed chain stores, their cheerful corporate fonts rendered in the harsh white of the camera's flash. The escalators continued their nightly routine, reversing direction at precisely 3:33 a.m. and running backwards for exactly 1 minute. I began timing other events around this moment, noting that the HVAC system would sometimes skip a beat, or that certain lights would flicker in sequence down the west corridor. The building seemed to hold its breath during that minute, as if reality itself required a moment of reversal to maintain its balance. My sleep during the day became irregular, filled with dreams of walking through the mall during its operational heyday. In these dreams, the stores were full of customers, but everyone moved with deliberate slowness, their conversations playing backwards like reversed audio. I would search for myself among the crowd, certain that I belonged there, but I could never find my reflection in any of the store windows. The lost and found office began to feel like a museum of my future selves. I organized the items by category, identification documents for versions of me who had made different life choices, personal effects from relationships I'd never pursued, mementos from experiences I'd never had. Each item told a story of possibility, of paths not taken and futures not yet realized. I found concert tickets for bands I'd never heard of, restaurant receipts from dates I'd never been on, membership cards for organizations I'd never joined. There was a medical bracelet indicating an allergy I didn't have, a business card with my name listed as the manager of a store that had never existed, and a love letter written in handwriting that was unmistakably mine but expressing sentiments I'd never felt. The rational part of my mind insisted that someone was playing an elaborate prank, but the emotional weight of each discovery felt too genuine to fake. These weren't replicas or forgeries. They were real objects carrying the authentic wear patterns and emotional resonance of genuine use. I began to suspect that rather than someone placing these items in the lost and found, I was somehow finding things that belonged to me in realities where I had made different choices. The building itself seemed to respond to my growing understanding. Doors that had been locked since my first day occasionally stood ajar when I passed, revealing storage rooms filled with mannequins arranged in conversational poses. The fountain began to emanate soft sounds. Not water, but something like whispered conversations in a language I almost recognized. The directory started showing my own name as the manager of various stores, with contact information for phone numbers I'd never owned. By early November, I was finding multiple items each night. A gym membership for a facility I'd considered joining, car keys for a vehicle I'd test-driven but never purchased, prescription glasses with my name on the case but the wrong prescription. The items seemed to represent not just alternative versions of my life, but specifically the roads not taken, the choices I'd considered but ultimately rejected. I began to wonder if the mall existed at some kind of nexus point, a place where the paths of possibility intersected and bled through into physical reality. The abandoned storefronts weren't really empty. They were simply displaying a different frequency of existence, one that my normal perception couldn't access, but that became visible under the specific conditions of late-night solitude and accumulated stress. The breakthrough came during the third week of November, when I found a security guard uniform with my name embroidered on the chest. The uniform was identical to the one I wore each night, but it carried the subtle signs of longer wear. A small tear near the left pocket, a coffee stain on the sleeve, a slight fading around the collar that suggested months or years of use under fluorescent lights. In the breast pocket, I discovered a folded piece of paper, my own handwriting, recording observations about the mall that I had never made. The notes described events I hadn't witnessed, including detailed accounts of conversations with coworkers I'd never met, and incidents that had never occurred during my shifts. According to the log, I'd been working at Eastwood Commons for 3 years, not 8 months. The handwriting was definitely mine, but the memories described in the notes belonged to someone else. Another version of me who had taken this job earlier, who had perhaps experienced different manifestations of the mall's temporal instability, who had drawn different conclusions about the nature of his situation. That night, I stood before the directory at 3:30 a.m. and watched as the display flickered and changed. For just a moment, I could see through the glass to the mechanism behind it, not electronic displays or printed panels, but something that looked like flowing water, carrying images of storefronts that shifted and changed like reflections on a moving surface. The escalators began their reversal, and I felt the building around me take its nightly breath. In that moment of temporal suspension, I understood that I wasn't discovering evidence of alternative timelines or parallel realities. I was experiencing the slow collapse of linear time itself, a gradual unwinding of causality that had been accelerated by the mall's abandonment and my own prolonged exposure to its emptiness. The lost and found items weren't arriving from other versions of my life. They were arriving from my own future, sliding backwards through time from events that hadn't happened yet, but would inevitably occur. The mall had become a kind of temporal sinkhole, where the normal flow of cause and effect had been disrupted, allowing objects and experiences to move freely between past and future. As the escalators resumed their normal dormant state, I realized that I was not just observing these phenomena, I was becoming part of them. The longer I worked here, the more unstable my own relationship with time became. The uniform in the lost and found belonged to a future version of myself, who would continue working here, finding items that belonged to an even more distant future self, in an endless cycle of temporal displacement. I walked back to the security office and sat down to write my incident report, but found myself recording events that hadn't happened yet, conversations I would have with maintenance workers next month, observations I would make about new changes to the building, thoughts I would think about quitting but ultimately wouldn't act upon. The mall hummed around me with its usual mechanical contentment, but now I could hear what lay beneath the surface noise. The sound of time itself moving in directions it was never meant to go, carrying pieces of tomorrow into yesterday, and fragments of yesterday into tomorrow. I looked at my watch. 4:17 a.m. In a few hours I would drive home and try to sleep. And tonight I would return to walk these corridors again. But I was no longer certain which version of tonight I would experience, or which version of myself would show up to work it. The lost and found was waiting for me to discover what I would lose next. Story 5. The whispers started 3 hours into the descent. I'd been following the rope through Devil's Throat. That's what we called the main passage in Mammoth's lesser-known sister cave, when the first faint murmur drifted up from the depths. My headlamp beam cut through absolute darkness, illuminating limestone walls that seemed to pulse with each heartbeat. The cave had swallowed 4 spelunkers 2 days ago, and dispatch had called in every experienced rescue volunteer in the Tri-County area. The whispers weren't on the radio. They came from somewhere deeper, past the tight squeeze we'd dubbed the Needle's Eye, a passage so narrow that only the smallest among us could navigate it. At 6 feet even and lean from years of rock climbing, I'd drawn the short straw. My breath fogged in the 40-degree air as I checked my equipment one final time. Headlamp, backup light, rope, first aid kit, emergency oxygen, and the helmet camera that would record everything for the debrief. Standard protocol required documentation of rescue operations, especially in unmapped sections like this one. The limestone had carved itself into impossible geometries over millennia. Water had sculpted corridors that twisted back on themselves, creating a 3-dimensional maze that could disorient even veteran cavers. The rescue team's base camp sat nearly 200 feet above, connected by a route that required 3 separate rappels and 2 crawlways barely wide enough for human shoulders. I squeezed through the Needle's Eye, my tank scraping against the rock. The sound echoed strangely, as if bouncing off surfaces that shouldn't exist. Once through, the passage opened into a chamber I didn't recognize from the survey maps. My light revealed a space roughly the size of a living room, with 3 potential exits branching off into darkness. The whispers grew clearer. They seemed to emanate from the leftmost passage. Urgent, pleading sounds that my mind wanted to interpret as calls for help. I keyed my radio, but static answered back. The limestone here was thick enough to block transmission, which meant I was truly alone until I made it back to the documented sections. Following protocol, I tied off a guide rope at the chamber entrance and began working my way down the leftmost tunnel. The passage sloped downward at a steep angle, forcing me to brace against the walls to maintain footing. Water had carved the stone smooth as glass, and more than once I felt my boots slip on the slick surface. The whispers grew more distinct. They carried the cadence of human speech, though I couldn't make out individual words. Male voices, at least 2 of them, echoing from somewhere ahead. My pulse quickened. After 48 hours, finding survivors would be nothing short of miraculous. The tunnel suddenly narrowed again, forcing me to belly crawl for what felt like an eternity. My breathing echoed in the confined space, mixing with those persistent whispers until I couldn't distinguish between my own sounds and whatever lay ahead. The rock pressed against my back and chest, a crushing embrace that made every breath a conscious effort. When the passage finally opened up, I found myself in another chamber, this one smaller and roughly circular. My headlamp swept across the space and I froze. 3 figures sat against the far wall. They wore the same orange rescue suits as mine, the same equipment harnesses, the same model helmet with the same white reflective strips. Even in the poor light, I could see that their build matched mine almost exactly. Tall, lean frames that looked like mirror images viewed through thick glass. I called out, my voice cracking with relief and exhaustion. The figures didn't respond. As I approached, my light revealed them in greater detail, and the relief curdled into something cold and wrong. Their faces were turned away, hidden in shadow, but something about their posture suggested they weren't unconscious. They sat with deliberate stillness, as if waiting. Their equipment showed no signs of damage, no indication of the injuries or exposure I'd expected to find after 2 days underground. I reached the nearest figure and placed a hand on his shoulder. The fabric felt right. The same textured material, the same thickness. But underneath, the body felt strangely insubstantial, as if it might dissolve at too firm a touch. When I tried to turn him toward me, the figure crumbled. Not collapsed, crumbled, like a sand sculpture touched by wind. The orange fabric held its shape for a moment, then folded in on itself, leaving only empty clothing arranged as if someone had just stepped out of it. My hands shook as I backed away, the beam of my headlamp dancing across the remaining two figures. They sat motionless, waiting. I tried my radio again, keying the mic with desperate urgency, but the static that answered carried an odd rhythm, almost like whispered words in a language I couldn't understand. The sound seemed to come from inside my helmet, as if the radio were picking up transmissions from somewhere impossibly close. The second figure crumbled when I approached it, dissolving into empty clothes with the same unsettling gentleness. I didn't touch the third. Instead, I stood in the center of the chamber, my breathing harsh and rapid in the thin air, and tried to make sense of what I'd witnessed. The whispers continued, but now they seemed to come from behind me, from the tunnel I just crawled through. I spun around, my light cutting through the darkness, but found only empty stone. When I turned back, the third figure was gone, not crumbled, simply absent, as if it had never been there at all. I ran. The belly crawl back through the narrow section felt endless. My light flickered twice, sending my heart hammering against my ribs. The whispers followed, echoing through the stone in ways that defied the physics of sound travel. Sometimes they seemed to come from ahead, sometimes from the walls themselves, as if voices were trapped in the limestone and speaking directly into my bones. I burst back into the larger chamber where I'd left my guide rope, gasping in the relatively open air. The rope was still there, still tied to the anchor point I'd chosen, but something was wrong. The knot was different, not wrong exactly, but tied with a technique I didn't remember using. A bowline instead of the figure 8 I always preferred. My hands fumbled with the radio as I tried to raise base camp. The static cleared for a moment and I heard my own voice speaking calmly about the rescue progress, reporting a successful location of the missing cavers. But I hadn't transmitted anything. I was listening to a conversation I'd never had, in my own voice, describing events that hadn't happened. The transmission cut out, leaving me in silence broken only by the sound of my own ragged breathing. I followed the guide rope back toward the main passage, checking my watch obsessively. The luminous dial showed 3:47 p.m., but that couldn't be right. I'd entered the cave at 9 a.m., spent maybe an hour reaching the Needle's Eye, and couldn't have been in the deep sections for more than 2 hours. The math didn't work. The rope led me through passages I didn't remember navigating. The limestone formations looked different, carved by water into shapes that seemed more deliberate than random. Faces emerged from the rock, not pareidolia, the tendency to see patterns in chaos, but actual carved features that my light revealed in disturbing detail. Eyes that seemed to track my movement, mouths open in silent screams or warnings. When I finally reached the Needle's Eye, I found another guide rope already in place. Orange climbing rope, exactly like mine, tied with the same knots I used, but leading in a different direction. The rope I'd been following continued past the squeeze, deeper into sections of the cave that weren't supposed to exist. I squeezed through the narrow passage, my equipment scraping against stone that felt oddly warm to the touch. On the other side, the familiar chamber where I'd started the deep exploration waited, but even here things seemed subtly wrong. The walls were the same limestone, carved by the same patient water, but the shadows fell in impossible directions, as if lit by sources my headlamp couldn't account for. The ascent back to base camp took place in a dreamlike trance. I followed the established route, clipping into the fixed ropes and working my way up through the rappel stations, but each familiar landmark seemed shifted slightly from where I remembered it. The cave was rearranging itself around me, or perhaps my memory was failing in ways that felt too systematic to be natural. I emerged into Kentucky sunlight that felt thin and unconvincing after the absolute darkness below. The rescue team's vehicles were parked exactly where I'd left them, but the shadows they cast pointed in directions that made no sense given the sun's position. My watch still read 3:47 p.m., the hands frozen in place despite the obvious passage of time. The team leader approached as I stripped off my gear, asking for my report with the kind of professional calm that felt scripted. I told him about the empty chamber, the figures that had crumbled, the impossible whispers. He nodded and made notes, as if these details were exactly what he'd expected to hear. That night, in the motel room I'd rented for the operation, I connected my helmet camera to my laptop. The footage would either validate my experience or prove that the stress and isolation had triggered some kind of psychological break. Either answer would be preferable to the uncertainty that had followed me up from the depths. The video played normally at first. I watched myself navigate the familiar sections of the cave, heard my own breathing amplified by the camera's microphone. The timestamp in the corner advanced at regular intervals, marking the progression from morning into afternoon. But when the footage reached the deep sections, where I'd heard the whispers and found the figures, something impossible appeared on the screen. In the background, just at the edge of my headlamp's range, another light moved through the passages, another helmet beam, attached to another figure in an orange rescue suit. The figure gestured urgently, waving me forward, pointing deeper into the cave, making sharp cutting motions that clearly meant hurry and don't look back. The figure looked exactly like me. I rewound the footage and watched again. There I was, in the foreground, crawling through the narrow passage, completely unaware of the other presence, and there, in the background, was my identical twin, leading me deeper into the cave with urgent gestures and familiar movements. The timestamp continued its regular progression, but now I could see the impossibility of what it represented. The video showed me following myself through passages where only one person could fit, guided by someone who shared not just my appearance, but my exact equipment, my precise movements, even the particular way I held my head when concentrating. I paused the video at the moment I'd found the three figures against the chamber wall. In the background, barely visible, my doppelganger stood watching. Not the crumbling figures in the foreground. Those appeared normal on camera, but the other me, the one who had somehow been there first, orchestrating everything. The footage continued through my panicked retreat, and in every frame where the camera captured the space behind me, the other figure was there, sometimes beckoning, sometimes pointing, always staying just at the edge of perception. A guide leading me through an experience that felt spontaneous, but had clearly been choreographed. I closed the laptop and sat in the motel room's harsh fluorescent light, trying to construct explanations that wouldn't require me to question my sanity. Equipment malfunction, digital artifacts, some kind of reflection or optical illusion caused by the camera lens and the cave's unusual limestone formations. But the figure in the footage moved independently, with purpose and intelligence. It had guided me to specific locations, led me through passages I couldn't have navigated alone, and somehow remained invisible to my direct perception while being perfectly captured by the recording device. I opened the laptop again and advanced to the final frames, taken as I'd climbed back toward the surface. In the last clear shot of the deep cave, the other figure stood at the chamber entrance, no longer gesturing or pointing. Instead, it appeared to be waiting, as if my departure had been just another part of the plan. The timestamp read 3:47 p.m., the exact moment my watch had stopped, the time that marked the boundary between the cave's version of reality and the world above. I think about that footage often now, 3 weeks later. I've shown it to colleagues who point out compression artifacts and suggest explanations involving reflected light and digital noise. They nod sympathetically when I describe the psychological stress of solo rescue operations, the way isolation and responsibility can manifest in visual hallucinations and false memories. Their explanations are reasonable and comforting, built on solid ground of medical knowledge and technical understanding, but they can't account for the fact that my watch started running again the moment I emerged from the cave, or that the rescue operation officially logged successful recovery of 4 missing cavers, one more than the number originally reported. The mission reports described the successful extraction of 3 individuals from the deep chambers, all in good health despite their extended underground stay. The documentation includes my helmet camera footage as supporting evidence, but when I review the official copy, it shows only empty passages and limestone formations. No figures in orange suits. No impossible guidance from my own reflection. Sometimes I catch myself checking the time compulsively, watching the second hand sweep around the dial to confirm that time still moves forward. I've requested transfers to other rescue operations, preferring surface searches and water recovery to anything involving caves. The limestone whispers follow me in dreams, and I wake with the certainty that somewhere beneath Kentucky's rolling hills, my doppelganger continues to wait. The rescue team leader calls occasionally to check on my well-being, his voice carrying the same scripted calm I remember from that final day. He assures me that post-operation stress is normal, that the mind processes extreme experiences in unpredictable ways. His words are meant to comfort, but they carry an undertone that suggests he knows more about the cave's nature than he's willing to discuss. I've stopped trying to understand what happened in those limestone depths. Understanding implies the existence of rules, of consistent physical laws that govern how reality operates. The footage on my laptop suggests that some places exist outside those rules, spaces where time moves differently, and where the boundary between self and reflection becomes meaningless. The whispers haven't stopped entirely. They surface in moments of quiet, usually in the space between sleep and waking, carrying the same urgent cadence I heard in the cave. They speak in my own voice, offering guidance for journeys I haven't taken yet, warning me away from paths I haven't considered walking. Sometimes I think the real question isn't whether my experience was real or imagined. The question is whether it matters, when the distinction between the two has become so thoroughly blurred that neither category adequately describes what remains. My watch ticks forward, marking time in a world that insists on linear progression and rational explanation. But late at night, when the whispers grow strongest, I find myself wondering if time moves differently for the version of me that stayed behind, still guiding other rescuers through passages that exist only when they're needed. The footage remains on my laptop, corrupted but undeniable, evidence of something that refuses to be easily categorized or dismissed. I've learned to live with its implications, even if I can't fully understand them. After all, some questions are more important than their answers, and some experiences resist explanation precisely because they point toward truths too large for ordinary comprehension. The cave is still there, of course. It appears on geological surveys and rescue operation maps, documented and measured with scientific precision. Teams continue to work its passages, following established protocols and safety procedures. None of them report unusual experiences, whispers, or encounters with impossible figures. But sometimes, when the conditions are right and the right person ventures deep enough into the limestone maze, the whispers begin again. And somewhere in the depths, my doppelganger adjusts his headlamp and prepares to offer guidance to another lost soul, gesturing urgently toward truths that can only be discovered in the spaces between what we know and what we fear to understand. Fortior. Story 6. The wind carved my name into the frost-covered window again last night. I discovered it this morning while making my rounds through the empty corridors of the Elkhorn Mountain Lodge, the letters spelled out in delicate ice crystals that caught the pale morning light. Each character formed with precision that defied natural explanation, the J perfectly curved, the double L in my surname standing parallel like frozen sentinels. 3 months into my winter caretaker position, and I still couldn't rationalize how weather patterns could consistently reproduce my signature across the glass surfaces. The previous caretaker had left abruptly in November, muttering something about guests that won't check out. Management assured me his departure was unrelated to the job itself. Personal issues, they said. A family emergency that required immediate attention. The morning ritual remained the same. Wake at dawn, check the generator, inspect the pipes for freezing, and walk the perimeter of the property. The Elkhorn sat at 8,000 feet elevation, accessible only by a winding mountain road that became impassable during heavy snowfall. Perfect isolation for someone seeking solitude from the world below. I'd taken the position specifically for that isolation. After the incident in Denver, the one that cost me my teaching career and nearly my sanity, spending winter alone in the mountains seemed like salvation rather than exile. The pay was modest but sufficient, and the lodge provided everything needed for survival: shelter, heat, and blessed silence. Except the silence wasn't complete. The generator hummed in the basement, a steady mechanical heartbeat that kept the essential systems operational during the harsh mountain winter. But sometimes, usually in the deep hours of night when sleep eluded me. The generator would surge to life with sudden intensity, as if responding to some invisible demand for power. The first time it happened, I assumed a brief power fluctuation or automated system cycling. The second occurrence made me check the electrical panel, searching for faulty wiring or overloaded circuits. By the 10th episode, I realized the pattern. The generator surged whenever my thoughts drifted to specific people. My ex-wife's face would surface in my mind, and the basement would rumble with mechanical thunder. Memories of my former students would trigger the same response. Even thinking about the mailman from my old neighborhood, a man I'd spoken with perhaps a dozen times, would cause the lights to brighten and the heating system to kick into overdrive. I began keeping a journal, documenting each incident with scientific precision. Date, time, duration of surge, and which person had occupied my thoughts. The correlation was undeniable, though the mechanism remained incomprehensible. Generators didn't respond to human cognition. Electrical systems couldn't read minds, yet the pattern persisted. Week 12 brought the first visitor. The side entrance, a reinforced door leading to the employee parking area, opened during a blizzard that had been raging for 36 hours. I heard the hinges creak despite the howling wind, a sound distinct enough to penetrate the lodge's thick walls. Through the security monitors, I watched a figure approach the main desk. The visitor appeared normal from a distance. Average height, winter clothing appropriate for the conditions, steady gait despite the storm. Only when the person reached the lobby did the anomalies become apparent. The smile seemed painted on, stretched too wide and held too long. Ice crystals clung to the stranger's eyelashes and lips, yet no evidence of melting appeared despite the lodge's interior warmth. "I need a room," the visitor said, voice carrying a peculiar echo as if spoken from the bottom of a well. Specifically, room 237. Room 237 had been closed for renovation since October. The previous caretaker's notes mentioned water damage and mold remediation, though I'd never investigated the specifics. The entire second floor remained off-limits during my tenure. I explained the situation, offering alternatives from the available inventory. The visitor's smile never wavered, never shifted, never seemed to involve the muscles around the eyes. "Only 237 will suffice," came the hollow response. Professional courtesy demanded accommodation when possible, and the lodge's isolation made confrontation inadvisable. I retrieved the master key and led the way upstairs, each footstep echoing through the empty building like gunshots. The visitor followed silently, leaving no wet footprints despite the heavy snow coating their clothing. Room 237's door swung open to reveal a space that contradicted my expectations. No signs of water damage or ongoing renovation work greeted us. Instead, the room appeared pristine. Freshly made bed, clean surfaces, functional heating system. Even the windows sparkled as if recently cleaned. The visitor entered without comment or gratitude, moving directly to the window overlooking the mountain valley. I waited for payment information or identification, but the figure simply stood motionless, staring out at the storm. "I'll need a credit card or cash for the deposit," I said. No response, no acknowledgement. The visitor remained frozen in position, smile still visible in profile, ice crystals still clinging to exposed skin. I repeated the request, then waited another full minute before retreating to the lobby. Processing could wait until morning. The important thing was maintaining professional standards and ensuring guest safety during the severe weather. Morning brought disturbing discoveries. Room 237 showed no signs of occupancy, despite my clear memory of escorting someone there the previous evening. The bed remained undisturbed, bathroom unused, heating system set to minimum temperature. Only one detail suggested a visitor had been present. Intricate patterns of ice covered the interior window glass, forming geometric designs too complex and beautiful to occur naturally. I searched the lodge thoroughly, checking every room, every closet, every possible hiding place. The building remained empty, except for my own presence. The side entrance showed no evidence of forced entry or unusual access. Security cameras revealed nothing but static during the time period when I clearly remembered the visitor's arrival. The incident might have been dismissed as stress-induced hallucination if not for the ice patterns in room 237. Those crystalline formations couldn't be explained through conventional means, and they persisted for 3 days before finally melting, despite the room's maintained temperature. A second visitor arrived the following week. This time I was prepared, notebook ready to document every detail. The same side entrance, the same methodical approach to the lobby, the same unnatural smile fixed in place. Different clothing, different physical characteristics, but the same ice-covered features and hollow voice requesting a specific room. "I need room 184, the new arrival announced. Room 184 existed on the first floor, part of the renovated wing that remained accessible during winter months. I agreed to the accommodation, again following professional protocols despite growing unease. The visitor moved through the building with purpose, navigating corridors without guidance as if intimately familiar with the lodge's layout. Upon reaching room 184, the same pattern emerged. Immediate movement to the window, motionless staring, complete lack of response to practical questions about payment or duration of stay. I retreated to the lobby and waited for morning. Dawn revealed another empty room with ice-covered windows, this time displaying spiral patterns that seemed to move when viewed peripherally. Again, no evidence of human occupancy, despite clear memories of escorting someone to that exact location. The generator surged constantly now, responding to every thought about the mysterious visitors. My journal entries became increasingly frantic, filled with theories ranging from hallucination to supernatural manifestation. Sleep became elusive as hypervigilance took hold. Every sound triggered investigation. Every shadow demanded scrutiny. By the 15th week, visitors arrived nightly, different faces, different voices, different room requests, but always the same essential characteristics: the frozen smile, the ice crystal adornments, the hollow echo in their speech. Room 142, room 309, room 155. Each visitor requested specific accommodations with unwavering determination. I began following them into their chosen rooms, observing their behavior with scientific detachment. The ritual never varied: immediate movement to the window, motionless contemplation of the storm outside, complete unresponsiveness to external stimuli. They remained in position until I departed, always standing in exactly the same pose with that painted smile directed at the glass. Morning inspections revealed the same pattern: empty rooms with ice-covered windows displaying increasingly elaborate designs, fractals that hurt to look at directly, geometric patterns that seemed to extend into dimensions the human eye couldn't properly process, mathematical perfection that belonged in textbooks rather than on frost-covered glass. The generator's surges began corresponding to the visitors' arrivals, as if the building itself anticipated their approach, powering up in preparation for accommodating guests that left no trace of their presence. The electrical system had become psychically linked to events that might not even be occurring. I stopped sleeping in my designated quarters, instead maintaining constant vigil in the lobby. If the visitors were real, I needed to observe their departure methods. If they were hallucinations, documentation might reveal patterns leading to psychological explanation. Neither observation proved conclusive. The visitors continued arriving through the side entrance, always during storms, always requesting specific rooms. I followed each one, watched them assume their window-gazing positions, then stationed myself in the corridor outside their doors. Hours would pass in absolute silence before exhaustion forced retreat to the lobby. Morning inspections always revealed the same impossible result: empty rooms with decorated windows. The ice patterns grew more complex with each visitation. Mathematical formulas appeared alongside geometric designs. Star charts mapped across crystalline surfaces. Written text in languages I couldn't identify, formed from frost and shadow in perfect calligraphy. Week 18 brought a visitor who requested my own quarters. "I need room 101, the figure announced with the familiar hollow echo. Room 101 housed my personal belongings, my journal, my sanity. I refused the request, explaining that the room was occupied by lodge staff. The visitor's smile widened impossibly, stretching facial features beyond human proportions. "Room 101, they repeated. "Tonight." The confrontation escalated beyond professional courtesy. I demanded identification, payment, explanation for the unusual requests. The visitor simply stood motionless, smile fixed in place, ice crystals accumulating on their clothing despite the lobby's warmth. Then they spoke my name. Not asked for it, not requested confirmation. They spoke my full name with perfect pronunciation, including the middle initial I never used professionally. The same name that appeared in frost on windows throughout the lodge. The same signature that weather patterns somehow inscribed on glass surfaces every night. I fled to the basement, seeking refuge among the mechanical systems that at least followed comprehensible rules. The generator hummed its steady rhythm, occasionally surging in response to my scattered thoughts about the situation upstairs. Pipes gurgled with circulating water. Heating systems cycled through their automated routines. Normal, logical, explainable. Hours passed before I found courage to return to the lobby. The visitor had vanished, leaving no trace of their presence except for ice crystals scattered across the floor in patterns that resembled written text. Messages I couldn't read in a script that seemed familiar yet incomprehensible. That night, my name appeared on every window in the lodge. Not just my room. Every piece of glass in the building bore my signature in frost and ice. Lobby windows, office windows, bathroom mirrors, even the glass panels on microwaves and coffee makers. Hundreds of repetitions spelling out my identity in crystalline precision. The generator surged continuously, as if the entire electrical system was responding to some massive cognitive event. Lights flickered in rhythm with my heartbeat. The heating system cycled through temperatures without regard to thermostat settings. Even the digital clocks displayed nonsensical times that changed whenever I looked directly at them. I spent the remaining hours until dawn walking through the building, documenting each occurrence of my name with photographic evidence. The patterns were too numerous, too precise, too widespread to be coincidental. Some external force was using the lodge's environment to communicate, though the purpose remained unclear. By morning, every trace had vanished. Windows returned to normal transparency. Electrical systems resumed proper operation. Digital displays showed correct times. Only my photographs provided evidence that anything unusual had occurred, and those images revealed nothing but empty frames when I attempted to review them. Week 21 marked the end of rational explanation. The visitors now arrived in groups, filling the lobby with their frozen smiles and hollow voices. Each requested different rooms, but their synchronized movements suggested collective purpose rather than individual accommodation needs. They moved through the building like a choreographed performance, taking positions at windows throughout the structure. I followed the procession, watching as they distributed themselves across 3 floors with military precision. Every occupied room faced the same direction, toward the mountain peak visible through the valley, as if they were attending some outdoor event that only they could perceive. From the lobby windows, I observed the truth that shattered my remaining grasp on reality. The mountain itself was writing my name. Snow patterns on the distant peaks had arranged themselves into massive letters visible from the lodge. Weather systems sculpted typography across acres of terrain, spelling out my identity in geological proportions. The entire landscape participated in the inscription, as if nature itself had become a cosmic printing press. I understood then that the visitors weren't hallucinations or supernatural manifestations. They were witnesses, observers gathered to document the phenomenon occurring outside the lodge. Their frozen smiles reflected wonder at a spectacle beyond human comprehension. But if they were witnesses, what did that make me? The answer arrived with dawn's revelation. Every room showed evidence of occupancy, rumpled bedding, depleted bathroom supplies, adjusted thermostats. The visitors had been real all along, leaving physical traces of their presence. Only the ice patterns on windows had been imaginary, psychological projections born from isolation and mounting paranoia. Except for one detail that refused logical accommodation. My name still covered the mountain in snow-carved letters visible for miles across the valley. Real visitors might explain the lodge's condition, but external weather patterns couldn't be influenced by human psychology. The landscape itself was participating in whatever was happening at the Elkhorn Mountain Lodge. I write this final entry as spring approaches and my contracted term nears completion. The visitors have stopped coming, but my name continues appearing on windows each night. The generator surges have become constant, as if the building's electrical system has evolved beyond its original design parameters. Management will arrive next week to assess winter damage and prepare for the upcoming tourist season. They'll find maintenance logs indicating normal operations and routine upkeep throughout the isolation period. Professional standards maintained despite challenging conditions. They won't find this journal, which I'm sealing inside the basement wall cavity along with photographic evidence of the winter's events. Perhaps the next caretaker will discover these records and understand the true nature of their position. Perhaps they'll have better success distinguishing between objective reality and psychological deterioration. Or perhaps they'll simply add their own documentation to the growing archive of inexplicable experiences at the Elkhorn Mountain Lodge. The visitors taught me one undeniable truth during our brief encounters. Some phenomena exist beyond the boundary between real and imaginary. Some experiences can't be categorized as either objective fact or subjective delusion because they occupy territory that transcends such simplistic distinctions. My name carved into mountainsides by weather patterns proves that observation itself can alter reality. Thought becomes action through mechanisms that science hasn't discovered yet. Consciousness reaches beyond individual minds to influence the external world in ways that appear impossible until they become undeniable. The winter caretaker position requires more than maintaining building systems and ensuring structural integrity. It demands witnessing events that challenge fundamental assumptions about the nature of existence itself. And sometimes, it requires becoming part of the phenomenon you're meant to observe. Tomorrow I'll submit my final report and return to the world below. But something tells me the mountains won't release their claim so easily. My name is written too deeply in the landscape now, carved into reality by forces that operate beyond human understanding. The visitors knew this truth. Their frozen smiles reflected knowledge that I'm only beginning to comprehend. Some winters never end, even when spring arrives. Some names, once written, can never be erased. Story 7. The fluorescent lights in Lab 7 had been flickering for 3 weeks now, casting intermittent shadows across the rows of abandoned workstations. I'd grown accustomed to the stutter-step rhythm of dying electrical systems, the way the building seemed to breathe through its failing ventilation. But tonight something felt different. The air tasted metallic, charged with the residual energy of equipment that should have been powered down months ago. My footsteps echoed against polished concrete as I made my way toward the server room, the sound bouncing off walls lined with empty chemical storage units. The company had folded 6 months ago, another biotech startup consumed by its own ambitions, leaving behind only debts and the legal obligation to properly dispose of sensitive data. That's where I came in, a digital janitor tasked with wiping clean the electronic remnants of failed dreams. The server room hummed with mechanical persistence, banks of drives spinning their final requiem behind locked glass doors. I'd been working methodically through the network architecture for 2 weeks, following protocols that seemed increasingly pointless. Every morning brought fresh mysteries that made my job feel less like data destruction and more like excavation of something that didn't want to stay buried. I pulled up the deletion queue on my laptop, watching the familiar list populate the screen. Research files, employee records, experimental data, hundreds of gigabytes waiting for digital cremation. The process should have been straightforward. Select, delete, verify, move on. Instead, I found myself staring at files I'd sworn I'd eliminated days ago, their modification timestamps reading tomorrow's date. The first time it happened, I'd attributed it to system clock errors or backup processes running on delayed schedules. But as the pattern repeated, files returning from digital death with impossible timestamps, rational explanations grew thin as the fluorescent light that painted everything in sickly yellow hues. I started with the genetics database, watching progress bars crawl across my screen as terabytes of sequence data vanished into electronic void. The cooling fans whirred louder, as if the servers were working harder to forget than they ever had to remember. Through the glass partition, I could see the thermal imaging camera I'd installed to monitor equipment temperatures. its LCD display showing the heat signatures of active hardware in false color rainbow. 40 minutes into the deletion process, I stood to stretch cramped muscles and grab coffee from the break room. The thermal camera's display caught my peripheral vision, a bright orange-red shape positioned exactly where my chair sat, human-sized and radiating warmth. I spun around to find the chair empty, still warm from my body heat, but unmistakably vacant. The display continued showing the signature for several seconds before it faded, leaving only the familiar patterns of server heat and HVAC ducts. I stood there for a full minute, studying the chair, the camera, the space between them. The rational part of my mind supplied explanations: residual heat, display lag, optical illusion born from tired eyes and too much caffeine. But my hands shook slightly as I settled back into the supposedly empty seat. Work continued with mechanical efficiency, though I found myself glancing frequently at the thermal display. The deletion queues processed without incident, progress indicators marching steadily toward completion. By 2 a.m., I'd cleared another 50 gigabytes of experimental data, sending proprietary research into digital oblivion where patent lawyers couldn't follow. That's when I discovered the backup drives. Hidden in a subfolder directory marked only with timestamp codes, I found storage arrays I'd never seen before. The file structure looked recent, created within the last month, well after the company's official closure. Inside were folders labeled with clinical precision: environmental monitoring, behavioral analysis, subject documentation. The largest folder carried a simple warning: do not open. Professional curiosity warred with growing unease as I explored the backup's contents. Most files were standard research materials: temperature logs, equipment maintenance records, environmental readings from various lab sections. But the Do Not Open folder contained video files, dozens of them, each labeled with dates spanning the past 2 weeks. My dates, the exact days I'd been working in this facility. The first video file showed a wide-angle view of the server room, timestamp reading last Tuesday, 2:17 p.m. I watched myself enter the frame, laptop in hand, settling into the same chair I occupied now. The recording quality was exceptional, capturing details I didn't remember noticing at the time. The way I favored my left shoulder after hours hunched over keyboards, the unconscious rhythm of fingers drumming against my thigh while programs executed. I skipped ahead through the recording, watching myself work and fast forward, occasionally pausing to examine moments I couldn't recall with such clarity. The camera angle suggested it was positioned somewhere in the ceiling, though I'd never noticed any recording equipment during my daily sweeps of the room. The second video file covered Wednesday's session. Again, the same precise documentation of my activities, the same invisible observer cataloging my movements with scientific detachment. But this recording contained something that made my stomach tighten. Moments where I appeared to be responding to sounds or movements that weren't visible in the frame. Brief glances over my shoulder, sudden pauses in typing, head tilts as if listening to voices the microphone couldn't capture. Thursday's file showed me checking the thermal camera display repeatedly, exactly as I'd been doing tonight. The recording captured my confusion as I studied the chair, the way I'd examined the camera itself as if searching for explanations that equipment couldn't provide. But from the overhead perspective, I could see what I'd missed in the moment: another figure, translucent and barely visible, occupying the chair while I stood beside it. My hands were trembling now as I opened Friday's recording. The figure was clearer this time, more substantial, sitting in my chair while I worked completely unaware just feet away. It wore my clothes, mirrored my posture, moved with my gestures in perfect synchronization. When I stood, it remained seated. When I returned, it occupied the same space, our forms overlapping like double-exposed photographs. The current recording, tonight's session, was still active, file size growing as it documented this very moment. I could see myself on screen, hunched over the laptop, watching myself in an infinite regression of observation. The figure in the chair was fully opaque now, indistinguishable from my physical form except for the impossible fact of its simultaneous presence. I closed the video player and immediately deleted the backup folder. watching as hundreds of megabytes of surveillance footage vanished from existence. The deletion completed successfully, file count dropping to 0, directory emptying with digital finality. I verified the deletion, ran integrity checks, confirmed that the backup no longer existed anywhere on the network. Then I refreshed the file explorer. The backup folder had returned, its timestamp reading tomorrow's date. Every video file was present and accounted for, including the current recording session that should have been terminated when I deleted its parent directory. According to the file properties, I'd been working in this room continuously for the past 18 hours, though I'd only arrived 3 hours ago. The building's ventilation system exhaled through ceiling vents, stirring papers I didn't remember bringing. The fluorescent lights continued their epileptic dance, casting shadows that seemed to move independently of their supposed sources. And through it all, the thermal camera displayed 2 heat signatures in perfect overlap, one sitting, one standing, both occupying the same impossible space. I tried calling my supervisor, but the phone lines had been disconnected months ago. I tried leaving, but my keycard wouldn't unlock the exterior doors. Its magnetic strip apparently deauthorized sometime between my arrival and this moment of growing panic. The building's automated systems hummed around me, maintaining perfect environmental control for experiments that had ended before they began. The deletion queues continued processing, files disappearing and reappearing with clockwork persistence. Every document I eliminated returned with future timestamps, as if the network was predicting its own restoration. The harder I worked to erase the data, the more substantial it became, spreading like digital cancer through storage arrays that shouldn't have had power to operate. In the thermal camera's display, the sitting figure turned its head toward me, though I remained standing perfectly still. It raised one hand in a gesture that might have been greeting or warning, pixels shifting in patterns that suggested recognition. When I lifted my own hand in response, the thermal signature didn't change, both figures maintaining their positions while I moved alone in the physical space. I opened the most recent video file, watching in real time as my image split into 2 separate streams. One showed me standing by the thermal camera, studying its display with growing confusion. The other showed me sitting at the laptop, working with calm efficiency to delete files that would return tomorrow, with my name attached to their creation. The sitting figure, my digital doppelganger, looked directly into the recording camera and smiled. The building's lights went out then, leaving only the server room's emergency illumination and the laptop's screen glowing in the darkness. In that reduced visibility, the thermal camera painted the room in heat signatures that told impossible stories. I was everywhere and nowhere, working and watching, deleting and creating, trapped in loops of observation that stretched backward and forward through time I couldn't account for. The backup drive spun with increasing velocity, their mechanical voices rising to harmonize with ventilation systems that breathed too rhythmically, too deliberately, like living tissue processing digital air. And in that symphony of failing technology, I heard something that might have been my own voice explaining the proper procedures for data destruction to someone who sounded exactly like me. I sat down in the chair, warm despite my absence, still molded to a form I'd never left, and began the deletion process again. The files would return tomorrow, carrying timestamps that hadn't arrived yet. The recordings would continue documenting work I'd completed before I began, and somewhere in the building's electronic memory, a backup of everything I'd tried to erase would persist with perfect fidelity, waiting for the moment when the difference between deletion and creation would finally collapse into meaningless distinction. The thermal camera displayed only one heat signature now, sitting in an empty chair, working to destroy data that insisted on surviving its own termination. Outside the server room, the building maintained perfect silence, its experiments concluded, and its subjects properly contained in storage media that defied every law of linear time. I deleted another file and watched it reappear, bearing tomorrow's signature like a promise of work that would never be finished. The screen reflected my face in its dark borders, but the thermal camera told a different story, one where I'd never stood up, never moved, never stopped working in a facility that had been closed for longer than I'd been alive. The backup drives continued spinning, preserving evidence of a present that hadn't happened yet, in a building where the only remaining employee was a memory the computers refused to forget. Story 8. The static crackled through my headphones like grease in a hot pan, and I almost missed it entirely. 3:15 a.m., the witching hour for ham radio operators when the ionosphere opens up, and distant voices pierce through the electromagnetic soup. I'd been scanning the 20-meter band for over an hour, picking up fragments of conversations from truckers in Nevada and late-night DJs from stations whose call signs I couldn't quite make out. Then I heard my own voice. Not similar to mine, exactly mine, down to the slight lisp I'd developed after losing a baby tooth at age 7. The transmission was weak, buried beneath layers of atmospheric interference, but unmistakably me arguing with someone about a broken toy truck. Words I hadn't spoken in 32 years tumbled through the speakers with perfect clarity, even reproducing the way I'd mispronounced hydraulic as hydraulic. My finger froze above the tuning dial. The argument continued, a heated exchange about whose fault it was that the truck's plastic bed had snapped in half. I remembered this fight. It had lasted for 20 minutes in our garage while rain drummed against the aluminum siding. But I was hearing both sides of the conversation now, including responses from my older brother that matched my memory with unsettling precision. The signal faded as atmospheric conditions shifted, leaving only the ambient hiss of cosmic radiation. I sat motionless in my makeshift shack, surrounded by the familiar green glow of frequency displays and the warm smell of vacuum tubes. My hands trembled as I reached for the logbook, though I couldn't bring myself to write anything down. What would I record? That I'd somehow intercepted a transmission of my own childhood? Kansas had drawn me here with promises of wide-open spaces and minimal radio frequency interference. The rental house sat on 40 acres of wheat stubble, far enough from Wichita to escape the urban electromagnetic noise that plagued most amateur operators. The landlord, a grizzled farmer named Rutledge, had mentioned the property's isolation as a selling point when I'd called about the classified ad. He'd seemed eager to rent, almost desperate, dropping the monthly rate twice during our brief phone conversation. I should have questioned his urgency. The next evening brought clearer reception. I'd spent the day installing additional grounding rods and fine-tuning my antenna array, telling myself that proper technical preparation would somehow make sense of what I'd heard. As darkness settled over the prairie, I powered up the transceiver and began my methodical sweep of the bands. The transmission came through at exactly the same time, 3:15 a.m., on the same frequency. This time the signal was stronger, and I could hear background sounds I'd missed before, the distant rumble of our old furnace, the creak of floorboards, even the faint whistle of wind through the gap under our kitchen door. The argument was different now, a heated exchange about a missing homework assignment that I remembered escalating into accusations of lying and threats of punishment. My 7-year-old voice pleaded innocence while my father's baritone demanded the truth. Every inflection was perfect, every pause precisely timed. I found myself mouthing along with my own words, muscle memory somehow preserved across 3 decades. When the transmission ended, I sat in the darkness for nearly an hour, afraid to move or make any sound that might disturb whatever delicate balance allowed these impossible signals to reach me. The prairie wind moaned around the house's corners, a sound that had seemed comforting during daylight, but now carried undertones of something vast and patient. I spent the following morning researching atmospheric anomalies and radio propagation, desperately seeking a scientific explanation. Ionospheric reflection could theoretically carry signals across great distances, but not through time. I found papers on electromagnetic field distortions caused by underground mineral deposits, theories about temporal displacement in areas of high geological stress, but nothing that could explain voices from my past broadcasting from where. The triangulation equipment arrived 2 days later, a sophisticated direction-finding setup I'd ordered overnight from a supplier in Denver. Installing it meant climbing the grain silo behind the house to mount the rotating antenna array, a precarious task that left my palms scraped and my nerves frayed. But by sunset, I had a system capable of pinpointing radio sources within a few degrees of accuracy. That night, as 3:15 approached, I sat ready with notebook and compass, waiting for the impossible transmission. It came right on schedule. This time, an argument about a broken window, and accusations of throwing rocks near the neighbor's house. As my childhood voice protested innocence, I watched the direction-finding needle swing toward magnetic south-southeast, holding steady at 152 degrees. The signal was coming from my own property. I repeated the measurement 3 times over the next hour, as the argument played out in its entirety, each reading confirming the same bearing. Using the topographical survey I'd received with the lease documents, I plotted the line and traced it across the property map. The transmission source lay approximately 300 yards from the house, near a depression in the earth that the survey marked simply as structure. Dawn found me trudging across the frost-covered field, following the bearing line with a handheld compass. The temperature hovered near freezing, and my breath formed small clouds that the wind immediately tore apart. As I crested a low rise, I saw it, a concrete structure partially buried in the earth, its sloped sides disappearing into the ground at angles designed to shed the fury of prairie storms. A storm cellar, the kind every sensible Kansas farmer built to shelter his family when the sirens wailed and the sky turned green. The steel door was painted a faded red that had weathered to the color of dried blood. A rusted padlock hung from the latch, secured from the outside. But something about the door's position struck me as wrong. The hinges were on the interior side, meaning it was designed to open outward, yet the door sat flush against the frame as if it had been pushed shut from within. I circled the structure twice before noticing the photograph. It was taped to the center of the door at eye level, protected from the elements by what appeared to be clear packing tape. The image showed a man in his 30s with thinning brown hair and wire-rimmed glasses, standing in front of a radio setup that looked remarkably similar to my own. The resemblance was unmistakable. It was me, though I had no memory of posing for such a photograph. My hands shook as I examined the picture more closely. The equipment visible in the background included several pieces I'd only purchased within the last year, including a frequency counter with a distinctive blue display that I'd bought specifically for this Kansas installation. Yet the photograph itself appeared aged, its edges yellowed and slightly curled despite the protective tape. The padlock came off easily, too easily, as if it had been opened recently and merely repositioned to give the appearance of security. The steel door swung outward with a prolonged squeal of protest, revealing concrete steps that descended into absolute darkness. Warm air flowed upward from the depths, carrying scents of earth and electricity, and something else, something organic and familiar that I couldn't quite identify. I returned to the house for a flashlight, my mind racing through possibilities that grew increasingly unlikely with each step. Someone was playing an elaborate practical joke, though I couldn't imagine who or why. I was experiencing some form of psychological breakdown triggered by the isolation and stress of relocating. The signals were real, but originated from an unknown source using sophisticated audio manipulation technology. None of these explanations felt adequate. The flashlight beam revealed a chamber larger than I'd expected, carved from the same concrete as the entrance. Wooden shelves lined the walls, holding an assortment of canned goods, bottled water, and emergency supplies that appeared decades old. But it was the far wall that made my breath catch in my throat. A complete amateur radio station occupied an alcove carved into the concrete, its equipment rack filled with transceivers, amplifiers, and test instruments. Some of the gear was vintage, vacuum tube rigs from the 1960s and 70s that belonged in museums. But mixed among the antiques were modern digital devices, including several pieces identical to equipment in my own shack. The station was powered and operational. Green LEDs glowed steadily, digital displays showed frequency readouts, and the gentle hum of cooling fans filled the subterranean space. A logbook lay open on the operating desk, its pages filled with entries in handwriting that grew progressively more familiar as I read. The early entries, dated several years back, were written in an unfamiliar script, cramped and angular, with letters that seemed to lean away from each other as if the writer had been uncomfortable forming them. But as I turned pages and moved forward in time, the handwriting evolved, gradually becoming more recognizable until the most recent entries were unmistakably in my own hand. The final entry was dated yesterday, 3:15 a.m. Transmission successful, subject responding as expected, beginning final phase. Below this, in different ink, someone had added, "He's listening now. Time to bring him home." I backed away from the desk, the flashlight beam wavering as my hands developed an uncontrollable tremor. The familiar scent I'd noticed earlier grew stronger, and I finally identified it. The distinctive smell of my aftershave, the same brand I'd used for over a decade. But underneath lay something else. Something sweet and cloying that reminded me of flowers left too long in a closed room. The radio equipment crackled to life without any visible operator. Speakers throughout the chamber began broadcasting the sound of footsteps on wooden floors, the creak of hinges, and finally my own voice calling out into the darkness above. I realized with growing horror that the sounds were coming from the house, from my movements just moments before as I'd prepared to investigate the cellar. Someone was monitoring me. Someone had been monitoring me all along. I stumbled toward the entrance, desperate to escape the suffocating atmosphere of the underground chamber. But as I reached the bottom step, I heard something that stopped me cold. The sound of the steel door swinging shut above, followed by the distinctive click of the padlock engaging. The flashlight beam illuminated concrete walls that suddenly seemed much closer than before. I called out, though I wasn't sure to whom, and heard my voice echo back from the depths of the chamber with a strange doubling effect, as if the sound was being amplified and rebroadcast through hidden speakers. As I climbed the steps and pushed against the door, testing its resistance, I became aware of another sound, the faint hiss of radio static emerging from speakers I couldn't locate. The static gradually resolved into voices, a conversation between two people discussing someone who'd been missing for several days, someone who'd left his equipment running and simply vanished. The voices were discussing me. I pressed my ear against the steel door and listened to my landlord Rutledge explaining to an unseen companion that the new tenant had been behaving strangely, spending all his time in the makeshift radio shack and neglecting basic maintenance around the property. He mentioned finding the man's car still parked beside the house, but no sign of the owner anywhere. The conversation continued, but I was no longer listening. My attention had been captured by a new sound, the deliberate footsteps of someone moving around in the chamber behind me, someone who had apparently been there all along, waiting in the shadows beyond my flashlight's limited reach. I turned slowly, sweeping the beam across the concrete walls and equipment racks, searching for movement in the darkness. The footsteps had stopped, but I could sense a presence nearby, something patient and watchful that had been observing my growing confusion and fear. The radio speakers crackled again, and I heard my own voice emerge from the static. Not a childhood memory this time, but words I was speaking at that very moment, transmitted live from some hidden microphone and rebroadcast through the underground station's equipment. "Hello?" I called into the darkness, and immediately heard my greeting echo back through the speakers with perfect clarity. The response came not from the radio, but from the shadows near the equipment rack, a voice identical to mine but carrying subtle differences in tone and cadence, as if the speaker was reading from a script. "Welcome home," it said. "We've been waiting for you to find us." I backed against the door, the flashlight beam dancing wildly across the chamber as my hands shook with renewed intensity. The voice continued, explaining things I didn't want to understand about signals that travel not through space but through time, about frequencies that could reach across years to touch the dreams of someone who hadn't yet learned to listen. The speaker emerged from the shadows, or rather, I emerged from the shadows, though the figure approaching me was somehow both familiar and wrong, like seeing my reflection in a funhouse mirror that distorted more than just physical features. We stood facing each other in the underground chamber, two versions of the same person separated by circumstances I couldn't begin to comprehend. "You've been broadcasting to yourself," my doppelganger explained with infinite patience. "Every night for months, sending those childhood memories back to guide you here. The equipment upstairs was just the receiver. This has always been the real station." As if to demonstrate, he moved to the operating desk and began adjusting controls with practiced familiarity. The radio came alive with my voice, not from the past this time, but from the future, describing events that hadn't happened yet but somehow already existed in the electromagnetic spectrum, waiting for the right frequency to bring them into reality. I listened to myself explaining how I'd eventually stop trying to escape the chamber, how I'd learned to operate the temporal transmission equipment, and how I'd begun the patient work of calling my earlier self home through carefully orchestrated radio signals. The voice from the speakers described a process that spanned years, requiring precise timing and intimate knowledge of my own psychology to succeed. The final revelation came not through words but through understanding that crept over me like cold water rising in a flooded basement. I was listening to myself describing how I'd become trapped in this underground chamber, and how I'd learned to reach backward through time to ensure my own entrapment. The voices from my childhood, the impossible signals, the photograph on the door, all of it was my own handiwork, performed by a version of myself that had been waiting in this concrete tomb for years. But as this understanding settled over me, questions multiplied faster than answers. Was I the original who had stumbled into this temporal trap? Or was I the copy, created by signals that had somehow pulled me from a different timeline? Did it matter? And most troubling of all, if I was destined to spend years in this chamber, learning to operate equipment that could reach across time, then who was the version of me that had initially been lured here by radio transmissions from his own future? The questions formed an endless loop, each answer generating new puzzles that led back to the same impossible conclusion. I was both the hunter and the hunted, the broadcaster and the receiver, trapped in a cycle that fed upon itself with perfect efficiency. Above us, the steel door remained locked from the outside, though I could no longer remember whether I'd secured it myself or if it had been waiting for me all along. The distinction seemed less important with each passing hour as I settled into my new routine of monitoring frequencies and preparing transmissions that would reach backward through time to guide another version of myself toward this same concrete chamber. In the logbook, I began making new entries in handwriting that slowly transformed from my familiar script into something more cramped and angular. Letters that leaned away from each other as if reluctant to form the words they represented. But the words themselves were clear enough, documenting successful transmissions and plans for future contact with someone who was, even now, driving across Kansas toward a rental house on 40 acres of wheat stubble. Someone who would soon discover the fascinating hobby of amateur radio and the mysterious signals that could sometimes be heard in the quiet hours before dawn, when the ionosphere opened up and impossible voices pierced through the electromagnetic soup to whisper secrets that only he would understand. Story 9. The fluorescent lights hummed their electric prayer above the Cascade Aquatic Center as I pushed my cart through the entrance doors. 11:30 p.m., same as always. The building exhaled its daytime warmth into the Oregon night, carrying with it the cocktail of chlorine, sweat, and something else. Something that reminded me of pennies left too long in stagnant water. I'd been working the night shift here for 3 months, ever since the divorce papers came through, and I needed somewhere to disappear into routine. The pay wasn't much, but the solitude was exactly what I craved. No questions, no concerned looks, no one asking how I was holding up. Just me, the mop, and 6 hours until dawn painted the skylights gray. The main pool stretched out before me like a rectangle of black glass, its surface perfectly still. During the day, this place echoed with the chaos of children's laughter and the sharp tweets of lifeguard whistles. But at night, it became something else entirely. A cathedral of shadows where every sound seemed to bounce back wrong, like an echo that had gotten lost and found its way back years later. I started with the locker rooms, as always. The ritual mattered. Spray, scrub, rinse, repeat. The ammonia smell burned my nostrils, but it was honest work. The kind that left you tired in your bones instead of tired in your head. In the men's locker room, steam still rose from the shower drains, even though the building had been closed for hours. I'd mentioned it to the day crew once, but they just shrugged and said, old buildings held heat funny. The women's locker room was colder, always 15 degrees colder, though I'd never figured out why. The mirrors there seemed to hold shadows longer than they should, and more than once I'd caught movement in my peripheral vision that turned out to be nothing when I looked directly. The brain plays tricks in places like this, I told myself. Too much quiet, too much space. By 1 a.m., I'd finished the locker rooms and moved on to the pool deck. This was where the work got meditative. Long sweeps of the mop across the non-slip surface, the rhythmic slap of wet fabric against concrete. The pool lights were on a timer, cycling through different colors every few minutes. Blue to green to purple to white. It was supposed to be calming, therapeutic, but at night it felt more like a slow strobe, each color change catching different angles of the empty diving boards and lane ropes. That's when I first noticed the arrows. I was working my way around the shallow end when the pool lights shifted from blue to green, and there they were. Distinct arrow shapes in the tile pattern at the bottom of the pool. Not mosaic work or deliberate design, but actual arrows formed by the grout lines, pointing toward the deep end. I stopped mopping and leaned on the handle, staring down through the water. The pool was supposed to be completely still at night. No circulation system, no jets, no movement of any kind. But as I watched, tiny ripples began to form on the surface, like someone was breathing on it from below. The ripples moved in one direction, following the same path as the arrows in the tile. I blinked hard and looked again. The arrows were still there, but now they seemed to shift slightly, the grout lines rearranging themselves in my vision like an optical illusion. The ripples had stopped. My supervisor had warned me about this kind of thing during training. Night shift isolation, he called it. The mind starts to wander, starts to see patterns that aren't there. Happens to everyone eventually. The key was to stay busy, keep moving. Don't give your brain time to invent problems. I went back to mopping. But 20 minutes later, when I rounded the corner to work on the diving well, I saw them again. Different arrows this time, formed by the same innocent grout lines, but now pointing toward the pool filters. And the water was moving again. Not ripples this time, but actual waves. Small ones, rolling from one end of the pool to the other like something large had just disturbed the water and was settling back to stillness. I set down my mop and walked to the edge. The pool deck was wet from my mopping, and my sneakers squeaked against the surface with each step. The sound echoed off the high ceiling, coming back to me distorted and delayed. I knelt at the pool's edge and dipped my hand into the water. It was warm. Not lukewarm, not room temperature, but actually warm, like bath water that had been sitting for an hour. The pool's heating system had been shut off since September, according to the maintenance logs. It was now mid-November, and the building's heat was barely adequate to keep the pipes from freezing. I pulled my hand back and dried it on my uniform shirt. When I looked down at the towel dispenser nearby, I noticed something glinting on the deck beside it. A small object, silver, about the size of a quarter. I picked it up. It was a ring, a class ring from Oregon State University. Heavy, traditional, with a red stone in the center. And engraved on the inside, in tiny, precise letters, were my initials and today's date. My hands began to shake. I'd never attended Oregon State. I'd never owned a class ring. And I sure as hell had never had anything engraved with today's date, November 15th, 2024. The ring felt warm in my palm, like it had been recently removed from someone's finger. I looked around the empty pool deck, suddenly aware of how exposed I was under the bright lights. The building had multiple entrances, and while I'd locked them all when I arrived, anyone with a key could have gotten in. Maintenance, management, security. But why would they leave a ring? And why would it have my initials? I slipped the ring into my pocket and tried to focus on finishing my rounds. The pool deck took another hour, and by 3 a.m., I was ready to move on to the filtration room. This was usually the easiest part of the job, just a quick visual check to make sure nothing was leaking or had come loose during the day. The filtration room was in the basement, accessed by a narrow stairwell that always smelled like rust and ozone. The pumps and filters hummed their mechanical song, a white noise that should have been comforting but somehow felt ominous at this hour. I made my way between the large cylindrical tanks, checking gauges and looking for any obvious problems. That's when I heard the first splash. It came from above, muffled by the concrete ceiling but unmistakable. Someone or something had just entered the pool. I froze, listening. The building's ventilation system whispered through the ductwork, and the filters continued their steady hum. But underneath it all, I could hear something else. The gentle lapping of water against the pool's edge, the kind of sound made by someone moving slowly through the water. I reached for my radio to call security, then remembered I'd left it upstairs with my cart. The stairwell seemed impossibly steep as I climbed back to the main level, my heart hammering against my ribs. Each step echoed in the concrete shaft, and I found myself moving as quietly as possible, though I couldn't have said why. The pool deck was empty when I emerged from the stairwell. The water was perfectly still, its surface like dark glass under the cycling lights. But something was different. The lane ropes, which I'd left neat and straight, were now tangled on one side, as if someone had been swimming laps and hadn't bothered to straighten them afterward. I walked to the edge and looked down. In the blue glow of the underwater lights, I could see something at the bottom of the deep end. Handprints. Dozens of them, pressed into the pool's surface like fossils in sediment. They covered the entire bottom of the diving well, overlapping and intertwining in patterns that made no sense. As I watched, one of the handprints seemed to lift slightly from the surface, as if the hand that had made it was still there, still pressing down. Then another. Then a third. Soon, all of them were moving, flexing like living things, reaching up toward the surface. I stumbled backward, my heel catching on a drainage grate. The ring in my pocket felt suddenly heavy, burning against my leg through the fabric. I reached for it, meaning to throw it into the pool, to get rid of whatever was happening here. But when I pulled it out, there were 2 rings in my hand. Identical, both engraved with my initials and the date. The pool lights shifted to red, and in that crimson glow, the handprints at the bottom looked like shadows cast by people who weren't there. I could see them clearly now. Men's hands, women's hands, different sizes, different ages, all reaching upward with desperate intensity. I backed away from the pool's edge, my mind racing through explanations. Hallucination, sleep deprivation, carbon monoxide leak. Anything rational, anything that made sense. But the rings in my palm were solid and real, and when I looked at my reflection in the pool's surface, I could see that my eyes were wide with terror, not confusion. That's when I noticed the filter. One of the pool's return jets was spitting something into the water. Not water, but small objects, one every few seconds, like a slot machine paying out in slow motion. I walked closer, staying well back from the edge, and watched as another ring surfaced and floated toward the skimmer, then another, and another, all identical, all engraved with my initials and today's date. The handprints at the bottom of the pool were moving faster now, some of them lifting completely off the surface, as if their owners were trying to swim upward. But there was no one in the water, just the prints, animated by some force I couldn't understand and didn't want to. I ran, not walking quickly, not leaving with dignity intact, but running. Through the main entrance, past my cart with its scattered cleaning supplies, into the parking lot where my old Honda sat under a flickering streetlight. My hands shook so badly I could barely get the key in the ignition, and when the engine finally turned over, I gunned it out of the parking lot like something was chasing me. I didn't stop until I reached the 24-hour diner on Highway 26, where I sat in a corner booth and drank coffee until my hands stopped shaking. The waitress, a tired-looking woman with kind eyes, asked if I was okay. I told her I was fine, just had a rough night at work. When I finally worked up the courage to check my pocket, the rings were gone. I called in sick the next day, and the day after that. When I finally returned to work, everything was normal. The pool was blue and still, the filtration room hummed peacefully, and there were no rings, no arrows, no handprints. The day crew said they hadn't noticed anything unusual. The pool maintenance logs showed normal chemical levels and water temperature. But I knew what I'd seen. I lasted another 2 weeks before I quit. Told my supervisor I'd found something better, day shift work that paid more. He seemed relieved, said most people didn't last long on the night shift anyway. Something about the isolation getting to people, making them see things that weren't there. I never told him about the rings, or the handprints, or the arrows in the tile. What would have been the point? He would have nodded sympathetically and made a note in my file about stress-related incidents. The building would have continued its cycle of day and night, swimming lessons and lap swim, chlorine and maintenance. But sometimes, on still nights when the air smells like pennies and ozone, I find myself driving past the Cascade Aquatic Center. The parking lot is always empty, the building dark except for the emergency lights that glow like red eyes in the windows. And sometimes, if the angle is just right and the shadows fall a certain way, I can see shapes moving in the water beyond the glass. Shapes that look like hands, reaching up from depths that shouldn't exist, leaving prints on surfaces that no one will ever check, creating arrows that point toward truths no one wants to follow. I keep the car moving on those nights. I don't stop, don't investigate, don't try to understand. Because deep down, in the part of my mind that processes things my conscious thoughts refuse to acknowledge, I know that some jobs follow you home. Some buildings remember their workers, and some waters run deeper than the blueprints suggest, holding secrets that surface only in the hours between midnight and dawn, when the barriers between what is and what might be grow thin as pool skimmers and twice as fragile. The ring on my finger, the one that appeared there 3 months after I quit, the one I've never been able to remove, grows warm whenever I drive past, as if it's trying to tell me something, as if it knows I'll be back eventually, when the loneliness gets too heavy and the silence becomes unbearable, as if it knows that some jobs never really let you go. Story 10. And the timestamp read 14:47:33 when my truck first appeared on camera 7. I stared at the grainy footage on my laptop screen, the familiar desert heat pressing against the trailer's thin walls like something alive. The image showed my white Ford pickup rolling past the surveillance marker, dust trailing behind it in lazy spirals. Nothing unusual about that, except I didn't arrive at the site until 17:20. 3 hours and 33 minutes later, I rewound the footage, watched it again. Same truck, same license plate, same dent in the rear bumper from last month's supply run mishap. The driver remained obscured behind tinted windows, but the profile looked right. Broad shoulders, the way I held my head slightly tilted when concentrating. Even the arm resting on the open window bore the same faded scar from childhood barbed wire. The coffee in my thermos had gone cold hours ago, but I sipped it anyway, needing the bitter distraction. Outside, the Mojave stretched endlessly in all directions, broken only by the skeletal remains of the old atmospheric testing facility. Concrete slabs jutted from the earth like gravestones, their surfaces bleached white by decades of relentless sun. The government had abandoned this place in the 70s, leaving behind only radiation warnings and the kind of silence that made you question your own heartbeat. My job was simple: monitor the perimeter cameras, log any unusual activity, and report back to the environmental survey team. Mostly that meant watching tumbleweeds perform their ancient dance and occasionally noting when coyotes triggered the motion sensors. The work paid well precisely because it was mind-numbing, perfect for someone who'd seen enough action overseas to appreciate the virtue of boredom. But this footage changed everything. I pulled up the camera's maintenance log. No malfunctions reported. The timestamp synchronization showed green across all units. I checked camera 6, positioned a mile back along the access road. Nothing. My truck hadn't passed that marker until the correct time. Somehow, it had materialized between checkpoints, appearing on 7 without transitioning through 6. The rational part of my mind offered explanations. Equipment failure, corrupted data, some kind of digital artifact. But I'd been working with surveillance systems for years, first in the service and now in civilian contracts. This looked authentic. I needed to walk the perimeter. The sun hung low as I stepped outside, painting the desert in shades of amber and rust. The air tasted of dust and something else. Something metallic that reminded me of the moments before electrical storms, though the sky remained cloudless. My boots crunched on the caliche hardpan as I made my way toward camera 7's position. The device stood mounted on a 20-foot pole, its lens angled to capture the main access route. Solar panels gleamed dully on its housing, and the status LED blinked its steady green rhythm. Everything appeared normal, yet the hair on my arms stood erect despite the heat. I followed the road backward, searching for tire tracks that matched my truck's distinctive tread pattern. The packed earth held impressions well in this climate. Footprints from my morning patrol remained clearly visible, but the deeper I examined the ground, the more confused I became. There were tracks, all right. 2 sets running parallel along the same route. One set matched the timing of my actual arrival, the impressions sharp and recent. The other appeared older, more weathered, as if they'd been exposed to wind and thermal cycling for days. Yet both sets came from the same tires, showed the same subtle wear patterns, the same alignment issues I'd been meaning to have fixed. The older tracks led away from the main road. I found myself following them almost unconsciously, my training taking over as I documented the trail. The tracks curved eastward, toward a section of the facility I'd never explored. The maps showed nothing but empty desert in that direction, yet the impressions in the earth told a different story. They led to what looked like a maintenance road, barely visible beneath years of accumulated sand and debris. The road terminated at a gate. It stood maybe 8 feet tall, constructed from the same industrial mesh fencing that surrounded the main facility. A simple chain and padlock secured it, the metal showing the orange patina of desert oxidation. Nothing remarkable about the barrier itself, except it didn't exist on any schematic I'd studied. I approached slowly, every sense hyper-alert. The silence pressed against my eardrums like deep water. Even the usual desert sounds, the distant call of hawks, the rustle of hidden lizards, had faded to nothing. The metal gate seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it, creating a zone of deeper shadow in the late afternoon sun. The padlock appeared old but functional. No rust on the mechanism itself, just surface oxidation that suggested regular use despite the abandoned appearance. I found myself reaching for it before conscious thought intervened. The metal felt cold against my palm, impossibly cold for something that had been baking in desert heat all day. The lock opened with a soft click that seemed to echo longer than physics should have allowed. The gate swung inward without protest, its hinges silent as if recently oiled. Beyond lay more desert, but somehow different. The landscape appeared subtly wrong, too flat, too uniform, like a photograph that had been stretched and compressed. The horizon seemed both impossibly distant and uncomfortably close, creating a sense of visual vertigo that made my stomach lurch. I stepped through. The gate clanged shut behind me with finality that made me turn, but it looked exactly the same from this side. Same mesh, same lock, same weathered metal. Nothing to suggest anything unusual had occurred. Yet when I looked back toward the road, the way seemed longer than it should have been, and the trailer where I'd been working appeared as a distant speck, rather than the quarter-mile away it should have been. My radio crackled with static, then fell silent. The GPS unit on my belt showed error messages, unable to acquire satellite signals despite the clear sky. Even my compass spun lazily, refusing to settle on magnetic north. I told myself to go back. Every instinct screamed retreat, return to familiar ground, file a report about the mysterious gate and let someone else investigate. But something stronger than curiosity drove me forward, a compulsion that felt almost magnetic, drawing me deeper into this impossible landscape. The ground beneath my feet felt different here, more yielding, as if the earth itself were somehow softer. My footsteps made no sound, yet I could hear echoes of footsteps that weren't mine, slightly out of phase with my movement. The silence had weight, pressing down like invisible hands on my shoulders. I walked for what felt like hours, though the sun remained fixed in its late afternoon position. The landscape never changed. The same endless expanse of desert floor, the same distant mountains that never grew closer no matter how long I traveled toward them. No landmarks, no variation in terrain, just the hypnotic repetition of step after step through sand that shifted under my feet in ways that defied the gentle breeze. Then I saw the trailer. It appeared gradually, wavering in the heat distortion like a mirage before solidifying into familiar reality. The same government-issued temporary structure I'd been working from, complete with the solar array and communication equipment. Even the coffee stain on the steps from this morning's spill remained exactly where I'd left it. I stood frozen, trying to process what I was seeing. The trailer sat in precisely the same position relative to the testing facility's ruins, but that was impossible. I'd walked in a straight line away from this location for miles. The mathematics simply didn't work. My watch showed 17:20, the exact time I'd arrived this morning, before discovering the impossible footage. Inside the trailer, my laptop displayed the same timestamp error on camera 7. The coffee in my thermos was still warm, exactly as I'd left it before going out to investigate. My morning notes lay open beside the keyboard, documenting routine observations and handwriting I didn't remember making. But there was something new. Additional text in my own careful script, dated earlier that morning. Investigation complete. Gate phenomenon confirmed. Spatial loop active. Duration approximately 3.5 hours subjective time. Return initiated by proximity to eastern perimeter. No memory retention between cycles. This note will not be remembered. Below that, in increasingly desperate writing, Day 7. Still trying to understand the pattern. The cameras always show arrival before actual arrival. The gate always opens. The walk always leads back. Previous notes suggest I've been documenting this for weeks. Day 15. Counted my supply inventory. No depletion despite feeling like I've been here for days. Time moves differently inside the phenomenon. Outside contact impossible during active phase. Day 23. Radio calls to base go unanswered during investigation periods. Suspect communication occurs outside normal temporal flow. Question: what happens to the version of me that arrives early on the cameras? The final entry, written in a hand that shook with exhaustion or fear. Day 31. Understand now. The loop isn't spatial, it's temporal. Every time I open that gate, I step into a pocket where causality flows backward. The truck on camera 7 isn't a recording of my arrival, it's a recording of my departure, seen from tomorrow's perspective. I'm watching myself leave a place I haven't been yet, arriving at a time that already happened. The investigation creates the very evidence that triggers the investigation. I don't know how to break the cycle. My hands trembled as I read words I had no memory of writing. The handwriting was unmistakably mine, but the experiences described felt alien, like reading someone else's dreams. Yet the details matched everything I'd just experienced. The cold lock, the impossible geography, the silent footsteps that echoed out of phase. I looked at the bottom of the page and found one more line, written in fresh ink. Day 32. If you're reading this now, you've just completed your first conscious loop. Tomorrow you'll forget again, but the investigation will happen. It always happens. The truck will arrive at 14:47:33. Outside, the desert wind began to pick up, carrying with it the sound of an approaching engine. I checked my watch. 14:45. Through the trailer window, I could see dust rising from the access road. A white pickup truck moved steadily toward camera 7, right on schedule. The driver's window was down, an arm resting casually on the sill, a familiar scar visible on the forearm. I watched myself arrive 3 hours early, just as the cameras had recorded this morning, just as they would record tomorrow. The footage would show my truck appearing without transition, materializing between checkpoints in a violation of basic physics. I would investigate. I would find the gate. I would walk through it and return to this moment, forgetting everything except the compulsion to search for answers to questions I'd already answered, but couldn't remember asking. The loop was perfect, self-sustaining, fed by its own contradictions. I reached for my pen to add another entry to the growing list, to leave some record of this realization for tomorrow's version of myself. But as my hand touched the paper, doubt crept in like desert wind through the trailer's gaps. How could I be certain these notes were real? How could I trust handwriting that claimed to be mine, but described experiences I didn't remember? What if the investigation itself was the delusion, and the impossible footage just the first symptom of a mind slowly unraveling under the desert's vast emptiness? The truck in the distance completed its circuit past camera 7, and disappeared beyond the next rise, beginning a journey that would end here at 1720 with no memory of where it had been. The me behind that wheel would discover the footage, follow the tracks, open the gate, and walk through time itself back to this moment of terrible understanding. Or maybe the me sitting in this trailer, staring at notes in his own handwriting describing impossible events, was simply a man alone too long in the desert, creating elaborate fictions to explain the slow dissolution of his grip on reality. Either way, tomorrow the cameras would record my truck arriving at 1447:33, and I would investigate. I had no choice. The loop demanded it, whether the loop existed in space and time or only in the failing architecture of my own mind. The investigation would happen because the evidence existed, and the evidence existed because the investigation would happen. I closed the notebook and prepared to wait for 1720, when I would arrive and discover everything for the first time again. Outside, the desert stretched away in all directions, keeping its secrets behind walls of heat and silence, and the kind of emptiness that could swallow a man's sanity without leaving so much as an echo. The only question that remained was whether I was trapped in impossible physics or impossible psychology. In the end, perhaps the distinction didn't matter. The gate would open either way. Story 11. The brass bell hanging in the Vermont house's attic hadn't rung in 43 years, according to the realtor. She mentioned this with the kind of casual emphasis that made my skin crawl, the way people deliver warnings disguised as trivia. The previous owner had been very specific about this particular detail in his will, she explained, her manicured fingers drumming against the kitchen counter. Under no circumstances was anyone to disturb the bell. I should have asked why. Instead, I signed the papers 3 days later, seduced by the wraparound porch and the mountain views that stretched endlessly into autumn's dying light. The price had been suspiciously reasonable for a house of this size, but I convinced myself it was simply small-town economics. Cities made people desperate. Rural areas made them practical. The moving truck left on a Tuesday afternoon, and I found myself alone with 16 rooms of echoing emptiness and the weight of my own questionable decisions. The house creaked and settled around me like an old man adjusting his bones, every sound amplified by the absence of furniture, conversation, or purpose. I'd bought the place impulsively after my divorce, drawn by some misguided notion that isolation might heal what 6 months of therapy hadn't touched. That first evening, I explored methodically, room by room, learning the geography of my new solitude. The living room retained the scent of someone else's life, pipe tobacco and old books, maybe lavender sachets tucked into forgotten corners. The kitchen felt cold despite the warmth of Indian summer bleeding through tall windows. Each footstep on the hardwood floors seemed to announce my presence to invisible observers. The attic access was a narrow staircase hidden behind a door I'd initially mistaken for a closet. The realtor had mentioned it only briefly, suggesting it might make good storage space once I'd settled in. The stairs groaned under my weight, protesting each step with sounds that seemed disproportionately loud in the gathering dusk. The attic sprawled beneath peaked rafters, larger than I'd expected, with dormer windows that faced in all directions. Boxes lined the walls, belongings the previous owner had left behind, according to the estate sale documents. But it was the bell that drew my attention immediately. It hung from a thick rope threaded through an old ship's pulley, positioned directly beneath the highest point of the roof. The brass caught what little light filtered through the dusty windows, gleaming with an almost organic warmth. The rope disappeared through a hole in the floor, presumably connected to some mechanism downstairs, though I hadn't noticed any corresponding fixtures during my earlier exploration. The bell itself was larger than I'd anticipated, roughly the size of a dinner plate, with intricate engravings that spiraled around its circumference. In the dim light, I couldn't make out the details, but the patterns seemed to shift and writhe when I wasn't looking directly at them. Probably just fatigue and unfamiliar shadows playing tricks on my perception. I reached toward it instinctively, drawn by the same impulse that makes children touch wet paint despite warning signs. My fingers stopped inches from the brass surface, remembering the realtor's words. The previous owner had been very specific. I lowered my hand and backed away, feeling foolish for the surge of unease that had accompanied that simple gesture. That night, I made camp in the living room with an air mattress and sleeping bag, too exhausted to properly set up the bedroom. The house seemed different in darkness, larger somehow, full of spaces that hadn't existed during daylight hours. Every settling beam and shifting floorboard carried implications I couldn't quite decipher. Sleep came fitfully, interrupted by the unfamiliar symphony of an old house adjusting to my presence. Wind through the eaves, pipes expanding and contracting, the soft percussion of mice in the walls. Normal sounds, I told myself. The acoustic landscape of rural living. Then, sometime past midnight, the bell rang. A single clear note that seemed to resonate through every timber in the house. It hung in the air far longer than physics should have allowed, fading slowly until I couldn't distinguish between its echo and the ringing in my ears. I lay frozen in my sleeping bag, heart hammering against my ribs, straining to hear any follow-up sounds that might explain what had just happened. The silence that followed felt aggressive in its completeness. I told myself it had been wind. Old houses developed their own weather patterns, their own pressures and drafts. The attic was probably full of gaps where settling had created natural wind tunnels. A sudden gust could easily have caused the bell to move just enough to produce a single ring. Logical explanations existed for everything if you looked hard enough. But I didn't go back to sleep. Instead, I lay in the darkness listening to my own breathing and the house breathing around me, wondering whether the sound had been real or if isolation was already beginning to affect my perception. The line between reality and imagination grew thinner in places like this, where solitude could amplify every anxiety until it took on physical weight. Morning brought coffee and sunlight and the blessed rationality of day shift thinking. The bell incident seemed less ominous in the clear light of dawn, just one of those things that happened in old houses. Probably wind. Almost certainly wind. I made a mental note to investigate the attic's weatherproofing when I had time. I spent the day unpacking, creating small islands of familiarity throughout the house. My books went on living room shelves, my clothes in bedroom drawers, my coffee maker on the kitchen counter, domestic anchors that might keep me tethered to sanity if the isolation began affecting my judgment. By evening, the house felt marginally more like home and less like a museum of someone else's existence. I'd avoided the attic entirely, focusing instead on the spaces where I'd actually be living. There was plenty of time to explore storage areas and investigate mysterious bells. No need to rush into the unknown corners of my new reality. The second night, I slept in the master bedroom, surrounded by familiar possessions and the comforting weight of established routine. The bed faced away from the windows, positioned so I could see the door but not the darkness beyond the glass. This seemed like good practice in a house where I hadn't yet learned to distinguish between normal nighttime sounds and legitimate cause for concern. Sleep came easier this time, aided by physical exhaustion and the psychological comfort of progress made. I was adapting, adjusting, beginning the slow process of claiming this space as my own. Everything would be fine once I'd established new patterns, new rhythms, new ways of being alone without feeling abandoned. The bell rang again at 2:17 a.m. I knew the exact time because I'd been checking my phone obsessively since the first incident, determined to document any unusual events with the precision of a skeptical investigator. The ring was identical to the previous night. A single pure note that seemed to emerge from the house's very foundations and rise through the walls like sound made solid. This time, I got up. The hardwood floors felt ice cold against my bare feet as I made my way downstairs, guided by the flashlight app on my phone. The house seemed larger in darkness, its familiar daytime proportions stretched and distorted by shadows and limited visibility. Each step felt like a small act of courage. The living room looked different. Not dramatically changed, not obviously altered, but wrong in ways that made my vision blur around the edges. The furniture had been rearranged, not moved exactly, but shifted just enough to create new relationships between objects, new patterns of negative space. My books were still on the shelves, but in different order. The coffee table had rotated maybe 15 degrees clockwise. The area rug lay parallel to the walls instead of diagonal. Small changes, subtle adjustments, the kind of modifications that might occur naturally if furniture had been bumped or shifted during normal use. Except I'd been living here for exactly 36 hours and hadn't touched any of these items since placing them. I stood in the doorway, phone light cutting through darkness, trying to convince myself that memory was unreliable and that I'd simply forgotten the exact arrangement of my possessions. People often remembered things differently than they actually were, especially when stress and unfamiliarity clouded perception. But the photographs changed everything. They sat on the mantelpiece in simple silver frames. Pictures I'd never seen before, definitely hadn't placed there, absolutely didn't remember owning. The photos showed me sleeping, captured from an elevated angle that suggested they'd been taken from somewhere above and to the right of my bed. Last night's sleeping position, to be precise. The air mattress in the living room. My body curled in the exact pose I'd adopted during those restless hours after the first bell. My hands shook as I picked up the frames, examining each image with the desperate attention of someone trying to solve a puzzle that might determine their survival. The photography was crisp, professional quality, shot with equipment and expertise I definitely didn't possess. The angle suggested they'd been taken from the attic, looking down through the living room ceiling, an impossible perspective, unless someone had cut holes in the floor above. But the ceiling showed no signs of damage, no gaps or modifications that might explain how these images had been captured. The photos existed without any logical explanation for their existence, and they were definitely, undeniably real. Physical objects with weight and substance, not hallucinations or tricks of perception. I checked the attic immediately, climbing the narrow stairs with phone light bobbing ahead of me, and adrenaline making every shadow seem potentially hostile. The bell hung motionless in the darkness, brass surface reflecting my light in fragmented patterns. The boxes along the walls appeared undisturbed, covered in the same layer of dust I'd observed during my first exploration. No camera equipment, no holes in the floor, no evidence that anyone had been up here since my previous visit. The next morning brought no relief, only the persistent weight of questions that had no satisfactory answers. The photographs remained on the mantelpiece, physical proof that something impossible had occurred. I examined them obsessively, looking for signs of digital manipulation or evidence that might explain their existence through conventional means. The images were genuine. Film photography, developed in an actual dark room, not digital prints. The paper felt authentic beneath my fingers, slightly textured in a way that spoke of traditional processing techniques. Someone had taken these pictures, developed them, printed them, and placed them in my house while I slept. But who and how? I called the realtor, trying to sound casual while fishing for information about previous break-ins or security issues. She seemed genuinely puzzled by my questions, assuring me that the house had been empty for months and that the previous owner had been very particular about security. No one else had keys. No one else had access. The bell rang every night at exactly 2:17 a.m. Each morning brought new changes to the living room, subtle rearrangements that suggested someone was slowly, systematically restoring the space to some previous configuration. Furniture migrated toward new positions. Objects appeared and disappeared. The room was evolving, transforming itself inch by inch into something that felt increasingly foreign, despite containing my own possessions. And every morning brought new photographs, images of me sleeping, always taken from that impossible elevated angle, always showing the previous night's exact sleeping position. The photography was getting closer, more intimate, capturing details I couldn't have known anyone was observing. My face in peaceful repose, my hand draped over the side of the bed, the specific way I curled my legs when dreaming. Someone was watching me sleep every night, documenting my vulnerability with artistic precision, and somehow managing this surveillance without leaving any trace of their presence. I started staying awake, sitting in a chair facing the bedroom door with a baseball bat across my knees and every light in the house blazing. If someone was entering my home each night, I would catch them. If cameras were hidden somewhere, I would find them. If this was some elaborate psychological game, I would beat it through simple persistence and aggressive vigilance. But staying awake didn't stop the changes. The living room continued its slow transformation, even while I watched, furniture shifting positions with movements so gradual they fell below the threshold of perception. I would focus intently on the coffee table's position, memorizing its exact angle relative to the couch, then glance away for seconds to check the time or examine a suspicious shadow. When I looked back, the table had rotated slightly, as if moved by invisible hands during the brief moment my attention had wandered. The photographs appeared despite my constant surveillance, manifesting on the mantelpiece between one blink and the next. I began to understand that whatever was happening operated outside normal rules of cause and effect, following some logic that made perfect sense from a perspective I couldn't access. By the end of the first week, I was sleeping 3 hours a night and consuming coffee like medicine. The house had begun to feel actively hostile, not just unfamiliar but deliberately unwelcoming. Every shadow seemed to conceal watchers. Every creak suggested footsteps. Every silence felt loaded with potential threat. The living room now looked nothing like the space I'd arranged upon arrival. My furniture remained, but its configuration had been completely altered, restored to some pattern that felt ancient and deliberate. The photographs had multiplied, covering the mantelpiece and spreading to side tables, creating a gallery of my sleeping self that felt like evidence in some cosmic trial. I found myself avoiding the living room entirely, camping in the kitchen or bedroom, trying to limit the spaces where changes could occur. But the transformation was spreading, seeping into other rooms like water finding new channels. Books rearranged themselves on bedroom shelves. Bathroom items migrated to different positions. Kitchen appliances shifted angles overnight. The entire house was slowly, methodically returning to some previous state. And I was simply an observer in this process, a temporary disruption in a pattern that would ultimately reassert itself regardless of my presence or preferences. The bell continued its nightly summons, that single clear note that seemed to trigger each round of changes. I'd considered climbing into the attic and removing the bell entirely, but something held me back. Some instinct that warned against interfering with mechanisms I didn't understand. The realtor's words echoed persistently. The previous owner had been very specific about not disturbing the bell. Maybe he'd known something I was only beginning to comprehend. On the 8th night, I found the diary. It appeared on the kitchen table while I dozed in a chair, materializing with the same impossible spontaneity as the photographs. A leather-bound journal filled with handwriting I didn't recognize, documenting experiences that felt horrifyingly familiar. The entries described a man who'd bought the house decades earlier, drawn by isolation and mountain views, hoping rural solitude might heal wounds that civilization had inflicted. He wrote about the bell in the attic, about warnings he'd initially dismissed, about changes that began slowly and accelerated beyond control. His words described my exact experience with eerie precision: the nightly ringing, the subtle furniture rearrangements, the photographs that appeared without explanation. But his entries continued far beyond my current situation, documenting months and years of escalating strangeness that culminated in complete spatial disorientation. The house had eventually rearranged itself so thoroughly that he could no longer navigate its rooms, lost in a geography that shifted faster than he could map. The final entry was dated 3 years ago. I understand now that I was never the owner here. I was always just a visitor, and my visiting time has expired. The house is patient but not infinitely so. It will reclaim itself completely, and I will find my proper place in its design. The bell knows when it's time. I read these words by flickering candlelight, having lost power sometime during the night without noticing when or how. The kitchen felt different around me, larger somehow, with walls that seemed to extend further into darkness than architecture should have allowed. My chair sat in the center of a space that felt vast and unknowable, surrounded by shadows that moved with their own subtle rhythm. The photographs were everywhere now, covering every surface, showing years of sleeping figures captured from that same impossible angle. Not just me, but others. Dozens of previous occupants documented in their most vulnerable moments, each face peaceful and unaware of the surveillance they were receiving. I recognized the diary's author in several images, his face aging across multiple photographs until he became an old man sleeping in rooms I'd never seen. The pictures told a story of decades, maybe generations, of temporary residents who'd believed themselves to be homeowners while something larger and more patient gradually reclaimed its space. The bell rang at 2:17 a.m., as always, but this time the note seemed different. Not a summons, but a farewell. A gentle acknowledgement that my time as a visitor was approaching its natural conclusion. The house had been tolerant of my presence, allowing me to believe in my ownership while it slowly, methodically restored itself to its authentic configuration. I sat in the transformed kitchen, surrounded by photographs of sleeping strangers, understanding finally that I'd never bought a house at all. I'd been invited to participate in something much older and more complex, a cycle of temporary habitation that served purposes I couldn't fully comprehend. The bell knew when it was time. Outside, wind moved through trees that sounded like whispered conversations, and inside, the house continued its patient work of becoming itself again. I closed the diary and waited for dawn, wondering whether morning would bring the familiar rooms I'd tried to claim as my own, or whether I'd wake in a space so thoroughly transformed that finding my way out would require navigation skills I'd never developed. The photographs watched me from their frames, dozens of sleeping faces that might have been reflections or might have been warnings, depending on how you chose to interpret the evidence. I chose to stop interpreting and simply wait, listening to the house breathe around me and wondering whether the person who eventually found this diary would recognize the handwriting as their own. Story 12. The basement of the courthouse hummed with the persistent drone of servers and the occasional click of hard drives spinning to life. I'd been working as a digital archivist for 3 months, converting decades of audio recordings from old court proceedings into searchable digital files. The pay was decent, the work solitary, exactly what I needed after the breakdown. My station consisted of 3 monitors, a professional audio interface, and towers of cassette tapes that seemed to multiply each week. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead with an irregular rhythm that had started to feel like a heartbeat. Today's batch came from 1987, a collection of civil cases that had been gathering dust in storage room C4. I slipped the first cassette into the player, adjusted my headphones, and opened a fresh transcription file. The familiar static crackled through the speakers before settling into the measured cadence of legal proceedings. Judge's voice, clear and authoritative. Clerk announcing case number 87 CV 2847, standard opening procedures. But as I typed, something felt off. The case file indicated a property dispute between 2 local businesses, yet no defendant appeared to be named in the initial proceedings. I frowned, checking the physical folder again. The plaintiff's name was clearly listed, but where the defendant should have been identified, there was only a smeared ink stain and what looked like deliberate redaction marks. The judge's voice continued through my headphones, and I felt my fingers freeze over the keyboard. The court recognizes the absence of the defendant in this matter, though we note the peculiar circumstances surrounding the individual who will, in approximately 37 years, be assigned to process these very recordings. My breath caught. I rewound the tape, certain I'd misheard. The words came through exactly the same. The judge was speaking about someone who would be assigned to process the recordings in the future. In 37 years. From 1987, that would be, I calculated quickly, 2024. This year, the transcription software had been automatically generating text as the audio played, and I watched the words populate on screen in real time. But as I stared at the monitor, additional text began appearing below what I just heard. Text that described actions I hadn't yet taken. The archivist will now check the case number against the digital database, finding no matching records. He will experience a brief moment of disorientation, followed by the realization that the audio quality has improved beyond what should be possible from a 1987 recording. I hadn't checked the database yet, but as I read the words, I found myself automatically opening the search function, typing in the case number. No results found. The audio did sound remarkably clear for a 37-year-old cassette. Too clear. My pulse quickened as more text appeared. The sensation of being observed will intensify now. He will look toward the security camera in the northeast corner of the room, noticing for the first time that its red recording light has been blinking in a pattern that matches his heartbeat. Against my better judgment, I turned toward the corner. The camera's red LED pulsed steadily, too steadily. I counted. One flash, then another, then a slight pause. The rhythm matched the pounding in my chest. I stood abruptly, the office chair rolling backward and colliding with the filing cabinet behind me with a metallic clang that seemed to echo longer than it should have. The audio continued playing through my headphones, though I'd moved several feet from the desk. The judge's voice maintained its formal tone. The defendant, though absent from these proceedings, has been observing through means that the court acknowledges but cannot officially recognize. The nature of temporal documentation presents certain irregularities that challenge conventional legal frameworks. I grabbed the headphones and yanked them off, but the voice continued emanating from the speakers at a volume that should have been impossible given my system settings. The transcription software kept typing, line after line of text, describing my growing panic with an accuracy that made my skin crawl. He will now attempt to stop the recording, discovering that the standard playback controls are no longer responsive. The pause button will feel warm to the touch, as if the equipment has been running far longer than the 43 minutes indicated on the digital timer. My finger hovered over the pause button before making contact. The plastic was indeed warm, almost hot. The timer showed 00:43:17, but that was impossible. I'd started the tape less than 10 minutes ago, and I'd been standing for only a few seconds. The recording continued, but now I could hear something else underneath the judge's voice. A subtle sound that raised every hair on my arms. Breathing, steady, measured breathing that didn't belong to anyone speaking in the courtroom. The breathing he now detects as his own, recorded from this moment, 37 years before his birth. The defendant in absentia has always been present in these proceedings, though existing in a temporal displacement that the court system was never designed to accommodate. I stumbled backward, knocking over a stack of case files. The papers scattered across the concrete floor, and I could hear them settling in the strange, amplified acoustics of the basement. But through the speakers, I also heard the same sound, papers falling, landing in exactly the same sequence. The breathing in the recording grew more audible, and I realized with a certainty that defied logic that it was matching my own respiratory pattern perfectly. When I held my breath, the sound in the recording stopped. When I exhaled shakily, the corresponding sound emerged from the speakers with a slight delay, as if traveling across decades. The subject will now notice that his movements are being documented in real time, despite the impossibility of such documentation existing in a 1987 recording. The paradox of effect preceding cause will begin to erode his confidence in linear temporal progression. I wanted to run, but my legs felt unsteady. The basement suddenly seemed larger than it had been, the shadows between the filing cabinets deeper and more numerous. The fluorescent lights had developed an irregular flicker that cast shifting patterns across the walls. Judge's voice emerged again, clearer now. The court notes that the individual assigned to these archives has begun to experience the phenomena detailed in sealed addendum 847A, which was filed by the defendant in anticipation of these proceedings. Said defendant, though chronologically absent, has provided testimony that the court finds both inadmissible and unavoidable. I forced myself to approach the desk, reaching for the cassette player with trembling hands. But as I got closer, I could see that the cassette tape itself wasn't moving. The reel sat completely still while audio continued to flow from the speakers. The counter still displayed 00:43:17, frozen on that timestamp. More text populated the transcription. Documentation of this session will be incomplete, as the recording equipment was never designed to capture temporal displacement events. The archive will show no evidence of anomalous activity, though the subject will retain full memory of the proceedings. This creates the necessary conditions for the psychological evaluation that was ordered by the court in 1987 to be conducted in 2024. Psychological evaluation? I had no record of any court-ordered evaluation, but even as the thought formed, I felt an uncomfortable recognition. The breakdown I'd experienced 6 months ago. the incident at my previous job that had led to mandatory counseling, the recommendation for low-stress archival work as part of my recovery plan. I grabbed the physical file folder, searching for any mention of a psychological component. Nothing in the visible documents, but there was a sealed envelope attached to the back cover that I hadn't noticed before. My name was written on it in handwriting that looked decades old, though the envelope itself appeared pristine. Opening the sealed addendum will provide clarification, but will also confirm the subject's status as defendant in absentia. The court recommends proceeding with caution, as the temporal loop cannot be broken once acknowledgement is complete. My hands shook as I held the envelope. The paper felt wrong, too smooth, too warm. Inside, I could feel something that wasn't quite paper. The seal came away easily, as if it had never been truly sealed. The document inside was typed on letterhead from 1987, but the content made my vision blur. Psychiatric Evaluation Order, Case 87 CV 2847, subject, my full name, spelled correctly, date of birth. My actual birth date, in 1989, evaluation date, October 15th, 2024. Evaluating physician, doctor, name I didn't recognize. Presenting complaint, temporal displacement psychosis, manifesting as belief that subject is experiencing events from the past in real time. Patient reports hearing his own voice and movements in recordings from before his birth. The document continued with clinical descriptions of symptoms I was experiencing at that exact moment. Racing pulse, paranoid ideation, auditory hallucinations, temporal disorientation. It described my behavior in the basement with the precision of real-time observation. At the bottom, in the section labeled Prognosis, was a single line. Patient will be unable to distinguish between documentation of psychotic episode and actual temporal anomaly. Treatment requires completion of triggering event. I dropped the paper, and through the speakers, I heard the sound of paper hitting the floor with perfect synchronization. The breathing in the recording had grown louder, more labored, and I realized I was hyperventilating. The subject has now reached the critical decision point documented in the original proceedings. He may continue to believe that he is experiencing supernatural phenomena, or he may accept that he is having a psychological episode requiring immediate intervention. Both interpretations lead to the same outcome: completion of the temporal loop that began with his assignment to this archive. Judge's voice returned, final and authoritative. The court finds that the defendant, though absent from these proceedings in 1987, has now appeared as required. The record will show that all necessary documentation has been completed, and the case is ready for final judgment. The temporal archive will now conclude its function. The speakers fell silent. The transcription software stopped typing. The fluorescent lights stabilized into their normal, steady glow. The basement returned to its familiar proportions, and the shadows retreated to their usual places. I stood in complete silence for several minutes, the only sound my own breathing that no longer echoed from any speakers or recordings. The cassette player showed 0.0. The tape hadn't been inserted properly. It had never been playing at all. On my desk, a new work order had appeared, or perhaps it had been there all along. Assignment for psychological evaluation, scheduled for October 15th, 2024. Today's date. But in my pocket, I could still feel the warmth of that manila envelope, though when I reached for it, my hand found nothing at all. And in the transcription file on my computer, there was only a single line of text. Session complete. Patient ready for evaluation. I couldn't tell if the text had been generated by the software, typed by my own hands, or if it had always been there, waiting for me to discover it 37 years after it was written. The basement hummed with its familiar electronic drone, and I knew that somewhere in the building above me, Dr. that unrecognizable name, was waiting for an appointment that had been scheduled before I was born, to treat a condition that might not exist, in a case where I was both the archivist and the defendant who had never appeared. I saved the file, logged out of the system, and walked toward the elevator, uncertain whether I was moving toward treatment or toward completion of something much larger than my own understanding. The red light on the security camera blinked once as I passed beneath it, but this time, the rhythm was entirely its own. Story 13. The salt air should have smelled like freedom, but it tasted like copper pennies on my tongue. I'd signed the contract 3 weeks ago, 6 months aboard the Meridian's Dream, playing piano in the Crown Lounge every evening from 7 to 11. The pay was decent, the accommodations private, and the chance to see the Mediterranean had seemed like exactly what I needed after the divorce. What I hadn't expected was the way the ship felt like it was breathing around me, metal walls expanding and contracting with each wave, as if the vessel itself had lungs. The first week passed normally enough. Passengers came and went during port calls, their faces a rotating carousel of vacation joy and cruise ship lethargy. I played the standards, Cole Porter, Sinatra, some light jazz that paired well with overpriced cocktails. The crew was professional, the food adequate, and my cabin on deck 7 had a porthole that showed nothing but endless blue. It was during the second week that I noticed the conversations. I'd finished my set and was packing up my sheet music when I overheard a couple near the bar discussing their excursion to Santorini. The woman, platinum blonde in a way that spoke of expensive maintenance, gestured animatedly as she described the whitewashed buildings and crystal-clear water. Her husband nodded along, occasionally interjecting with comments about the wine tasting they'd attended. The next evening, I heard the exact same conversation, word for word. The woman's gestures were identical, her husband's interjections perfectly timed. Even the bartender's responses were the same, a knowing chuckle here, a sympathetic nod there. I told myself it was coincidence. People on cruises talked about the same things, the same excursions, the same restaurants, the same photo opportunities. But as the days passed, the repetition became undeniable. Not just similar conversations, but identical ones, delivered with the same inflections, the same pauses, the same background sounds of clinking glasses and muffled laughter. The ship's daily schedule never changed either. We were supposedly island hopping through the Greek archipelago, but every morning brought the same announcement over the intercom. Ladies and gentlemen, we'll be arriving at our next port of call at approximately 2 o'clock this afternoon. The voice belonged to the cruise director, a perpetually cheerful woman whose enthusiasm never seemed to waver, never seemed to acknowledge that she'd made the same announcement yesterday and the day before that. I started keeping a journal, documenting the repetitions. The elderly man who always ordered a gin and tonic at 8:47 p.m. and complained about his arthritis. The young couple who argued about their dinner reservations every night at 9:15, always reaching the same resolution. The woman in the red dress who invariably spilled her martini at 10:23, prompting the same apologies and the same cleanup routine from the staff. My own performances became part of the pattern. Requests for "The Way You Look Tonight" at 8:30, "Fly Me to the Moon" at 9:45, and always, someone asking for "As Time Goes By," just before I finished for the evening. The applause came at the same moments, the same intensity, the same duration. But the most unsettling discovery came during my third week, when I found the elevator that led to Deck 0. 5. I'd been exploring the ship during my downtime, trying to map out its layout in my mind. The Meridian's Dream was massive, 15 decks of restaurants, shops, theaters, and pools. I thought I'd seen it all until I noticed the elevator bank near the stern that had buttons I'd never paid attention to before. Most elevators went from Deck 1 to Deck 15, but this one had an additional button between the lobby and Deck 2. 5. Curiosity got the better of me. I pressed it. The elevator descended with a mechanical whir that seemed to last too long for such a short distance. When the doors opened, I found myself in a space that defied the ship's architecture. The ceiling was lower here, and the corridor stretched in both directions farther than should have been possible given the ship's width. The carpet was the same nautical blue as the rest of the vessel, but it seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it. I followed the corridor to the left and discovered a lounge identical to the Crown Lounge where I performed, complete with the same piano, the same seating arrangement, the same panoramic windows showing the same endless ocean. But this lounge was empty, not just of people, it was empty of life itself. The air felt stagnant, heavy with the weight of unplayed melodies and unspoken words. I sat at the piano bench and lifted the fallboard. The keys were dust-free, perfectly maintained, waiting. Without thinking, I began to play. The notes filled the empty space with a hollow resonance that seemed to echo not just through the room, but through something deeper, something that existed between the spaces I could see. I played for an audience of empty chairs, red velvet seats that faced the piano with patient attention. But as the music continued, I began to feel watched, not by eyes, but by something more fundamental, a presence that existed in the space between notes, in the pause between one measure and the next. The sensation grew stronger with each song, until I could no longer ignore the certainty that every empty chair held a listener I couldn't see. The applause, when it came, was silence itself. Not the absence of sound, but silence as an active force, pressing against my eardrums with the weight of 1,000 unheard ovations. I stopped playing and left immediately, but the elevator wouldn't respond to my frantic button presses. The 005 button glowed with a steady amber light, but pressing it did nothing. The other buttons remained dark and unresponsive. After what felt like hours but was probably only minutes, the elevator suddenly lurched into motion, carrying me back to deck 1 without any input from me. That night I couldn't sleep. The ship's movement felt different, not the gentle rolling motion of waves, but something more purposeful, as if we were following a predetermined path that had nothing to do with wind or current. I pressed my face to the porthole and saw something that made my breath catch in my throat. The stars were wrong, not different, wrong. They formed patterns I'd never seen before, constellations that hurt to look at directly, as if they existed in a dimension that my eyes weren't equipped to process. And below them, the ocean wasn't the familiar blue-black of deep water, but something that seemed to absorb light and meaning, leaving only an absence that stretched to every horizon. I spent the next day trying to find someone, anyone, who would acknowledge that something was happening. But every conversation followed its script. Every passenger delivered their lines with the same timing, the same emotions, the same gestures. When I tried to deviate from my own role, asking different questions or changing my routine, people simply didn't seem to hear me. Their responses came as if I'd said exactly what they expected, regardless of my actual words. The cruise director's office was locked when I tried to find her during the day. The purser's desk was unmanned except during specific hours, and when those hours came, the staff member behind the counter responded to my concerns with the same scripted pleasantries, assuring me that everything was perfectly normal and that I should enjoy my voyage. It was the navigation chart that finally broke what remained of my rationality. I'd found the chart room during one of my increasingly frantic explorations of the ship. It was tucked away on deck 12, behind a door marked "Authorized Personnel Only," that opened easily under my hand. Inside, nautical charts covered every wall, showing shipping lanes and ocean depths, wind patterns and current flows. But the chart showing our current position made no sense. The Mediterranean Sea was there, outlined in familiar blue ink. The islands we were supposedly visiting were marked with precise coordinates. But the blue ink was fading as I watched, growing paler and more transparent, until it disappeared entirely, leaving only the outlines of land masses floating in white space. And there, where our ship's position should have been marked, someone had drawn a perfect circle in black ink. Not a course or a destination, but a circle with no beginning and no end. Inside the circle, written in handwriting I didn't recognize but somehow knew was my own, was a single word: return. The word seemed to pulse on the page, growing darker and more insistent with each beat of my heart. I tried to look away, but my eyes kept drifting back to that circle, that impossible loop that had become our world. I understood then that we weren't traveling between islands, weren't following any route that existed on earthly maps. We were caught in something else entirely, a voyage that had become its own destination, a journey that fed on repetition and routine, growing stronger with each passenger who accepted their role in its endless performance. The piano in the Crown Lounge called to me that evening with a gravity I couldn't resist. As I took my place at the bench, I noticed that the audience looked different somehow, though I couldn't pinpoint exactly how. Their faces were the same, their clothes unchanged, but there was something in their eyes, a depth that hadn't been there before, as if they were looking at me from somewhere very far away. I began to play, and the familiar requests came at their appointed times. But tonight I could hear something else in the music, a harmony that seemed to come from the ship itself, from the very structure of our floating prison. The melody I played was joined by notes I wasn't striking, chords that resonated from the walls and ceiling, creating a symphony that no single piano could produce. As the evening progressed, I realized that my audience wasn't just listening, they were conducting. Every gesture, every nod, every silent moment of attention was directing not just my performance, but the performance of the ship itself, the endless repetition that kept us circling in that black ink loop, going nowhere and everywhere at once. The final song of the evening was always, "As Time Goes By," and tonight was no different. But as I played those familiar notes, I understood that time wasn't going by at all. It was standing still, trapped in our circle just as we were, marking the same moments over and over again while something vast and patient watched from the spaces between seconds. When the last note faded, the applause came as it always did. But tonight I could hear what it really was. Not the appreciation of an audience, but the sound of a trap closing, of a door sealing shut, of a circle completing itself for another rotation. I looked out at my audience, at their familiar faces wearing their familiar expressions, and saw myself reflected in their eyes. Not as I was, but as I would become. Another passenger delivering scripted lines, another performer playing the same songs for the same empty chairs on Deck 05. Another voice in the endless conversation that kept our voyage alive. The ship rolled gently beneath us, following its circular course through waters that existed only in the space between one moment and the next. Outside the panoramic windows, the stars continued their impossible dance, and somewhere in the distance, I could hear the elevator doors opening and closing, carrying passengers between decks that might not exist, delivering them to destinations they would never reach. Tomorrow, I would play the same songs at the same times. The conversations would repeat themselves with clockwork precision. The announcements would promise ports of call that we would never see. And in the chart room, that perfect circle would continue to pulse with patient inevitability, marking our position not in space, but in time itself, caught forever in the moment between departure and arrival, between memory and destination, between the voyage we thought we were taking and the one we could never leave. I closed the piano and gathered my sheet music, but I knew that tomorrow I would return to this bench, just as I had returned every night since the voyage began, just as I would return every night until the stars fell into the sea or the sea rose to meet them, whichever came first in a world where neither time nor distance held any meaning. The word return echoed in my mind as I walked back to my cabin, and I couldn't tell if it was a command, a promise, or simply the truth of what we had all become. Passengers on a ship that had forgotten how to stop, musicians playing for an audience that had forgotten how to leave, travelers on a journey that had become its own eternal destination. The salt air still tasted like copper pennies, but now I understood why. It was the taste of time itself, corroding in the endless loop of our floating prison, dissolving everything except the performance that kept us alive and the circle that kept us trapped. And somewhere in the distance, barely audible above the ship's mechanical breathing, I could hear the faint sound of piano music drifting up from Deck 05, where empty chairs waited patiently for a concert that would never end. Story 14. The job posting had been simple enough. Lighthouse keeper wanted, remote location, minimal human contact, apply within. After what happened in the city, minimal human contact sounded like salvation. I'd taken the position without visiting the site, sight unseen, desperate to escape the weight of scrutiny that followed me everywhere after the trial. Gull's Point Lighthouse squatted on a jagged outcrop of granite like a bone-white finger pointing accusingly at the gray Maine sky. The previous keeper had left suddenly, according to the harbor master who'd ferried me across the choppy water that first morning. Family emergency, he'd said, though his eyes suggested otherwise. The way he'd glanced at the lighthouse, then quickly away, reminded me of how people had looked at me during those final weeks in Boston. The lighthouse had been decommissioned in 1987, its beacon replaced by a more modern navigation system closer to shore. My job was simple: maintain the structure, prevent vandalism, and ensure the foghorn remained operational for emergency maritime use. The Coast Guard still tested it monthly, sending automated signals to verify its function. Simple work, quiet work, exactly what I needed. The first 3 days passed without incident. I settled into the keeper's quarters, a sparse but comfortable apartment built into the lighthouse's base. The isolation felt like medicine after months of legal proceedings, depositions, and the constant presence of reporters who seemed to materialize whenever I stepped outside. Here, only the gulls watched me, and they asked no questions about what had really happened that night in the financial district. The fog rolled in on Thursday evening, thick as wool, transforming the familiar coastline into something alien. I'd grown accustomed to the rhythmic crash of waves against the rocks below, but the fog muffled even that, leaving an oppressive quiet that seemed to press against my eardrums. I was reading when the foghorn first sounded. 3 short blasts, 3 long, 3 short. SOS, standard distress signal. Nothing unusual there. The Coast Guard probably testing the system, even though their schedule showed the next test wasn't due for 2 weeks. I returned to my book, trying to ignore the prickle of unease that had settled between my shoulder blades. But then it continued. Short, short, short. Long, short, short. Short, long, short, long. SUE, my ex-wife's name. I set down the book, my hands suddenly unsteady. Coincidence. Random signals caused by mechanical malfunction. The foghorn system was decades old. Automated systems could glitch. I'd been alone too long, my mind seeking patterns where none existed. Short, long, short. Short, long, short, long, long. REQ. The word formed in my mind before I could stop it. Request. But request for what? I stood, pacing to the window that faced the automated control room. Through the fog, I could see nothing. The building might as well have been on another continent. Long, long, short. Short, short, short. Long. MSO money's somewhere only. The phrase hit me like ice water. It was part of a longer sentence, something I'd said to my business partner 3 years ago during our final argument. The money's somewhere only I know about, and you'll never find it without me. Words spoken in anger, words that had eventually led to the lawsuit, the investigations, the newspaper headlines, words I'd never told anyone else. I backed away from the window, my breath fogging the glass. The foghorn continued its methodical confession, spelling out fragments of conversations I'd thought were private, buried with the relationships that had died around me. My throat constricted. The fog seemed to thicken, pressing against the windows like curious fingers. Mechanical malfunction. I repeated the phrase like a mantra, but my voice sounded thin in the lighthouse's hollow interior. Old buildings made sounds, steam pipes, settling foundations. The mind created meaning from chaos when stressed enough. The blasts stopped near midnight, leaving behind a silence so complete it felt solid. I lay in the narrow keeper's bed, staring at the ceiling, every muscle tense. Sleep came fitfully, filled with dreams of depositions and disapproving faces. I woke before dawn to the sound of the lighthouse beam rotating overhead, its automated sweep casting pale rectangles across my wall. Wait. The lighthouse had been decommissioned. The beacon shouldn't be operational. I climbed the spiral stairs 3 at a time, my bare feet slapping against the cold metal. The beam housing sat dark and motionless. No power ran to the lamp. No switches had been thrown. Yet I'd clearly heard the mechanism rotating, seen the light patterns on my wall. Standing in the lens room as dawn broke gray and reluctant, I pressed my palms against the thick glass. The fog had lifted enough to reveal the rocky shoreline below, and there, pressed into a thin layer of sand between the tide pools, I saw them. Footprints. Bare human footprints, still dark with moisture, leading from the water's edge toward the lighthouse. They disappeared where the rocks began, but the pattern was clear. Someone had walked out of the ocean and approached the building during the night. My hands left fog prints on the glass as I traced the path with my finger. The footprints were too large to be mine, too regular to be natural formations. But who would swim to shore in these waters? The nearest inhabited land was 5 miles away, and the November ocean was brutal enough to kill an unprepared swimmer within minutes. I descended to the keeper's quarters and made coffee with hands that trembled slightly. The logical explanations felt increasingly fragile. Maybe someone had accessed the lighthouse by boat during the fog, though I'd heard no engine. Maybe the Coast Guard had conducted an unscheduled inspection, though they would have announced themselves. Maybe I was losing my mind. The trial had been particularly brutal during its final weeks. Sleepless nights, constant scrutiny, the knowledge that my reputation and freedom hung on the testimony of people who'd already decided I was guilty. My lawyer had mentioned stress-induced hallucinations as a possible defense strategy, though we'd never pursued it. The mind can fracture under sufficient pressure, he'd said, create entire realities to escape unbearable truth. But the foghorn's messages felt too specific, too accurate to be random imagination. And the footprints were real enough to photograph, though my phone's battery had died sometime during the night. Friday passed quietly. I avoided the windows facing the automated control room, kept busy with maintenance tasks that required no thought. The fog remained offshore, a gray wall marking the horizon like an approaching storm. As evening fell, I considered radiating the harbor master for an early pickup. But what would I tell him? That the decommissioned lighthouse was sending me coded messages? That someone was walking out of the ocean at night? The fog rolled in with the darkness, and the messages began again. This time they were longer, more personal. Short, long, short, short, short. Long, short, long, long. Short. The letters formed words that spelled out conversations from my divorce proceedings, private arguments with business partners, even the exact wording of emails I'd thought were permanently deleted. Each revelation felt like a scalpel opening old wounds, exposing secrets I'd buried so deeply I'd almost convinced myself they'd never existed. But most disturbing were the messages that described thoughts I'd never spoken aloud. Private moments of doubt, fear, regret. The internal monologue I'd shared with no one. The foghorn recited them with mechanical precision, as if reading from some invisible transcript of my consciousness. I found myself standing at the base of the lighthouse, drawn outside despite the chill. The fog swirled around me, thick enough to taste. Above, I could see a faint glow from the lighthouse beam, impossible but undeniable. The light swept in steady intervals, and in its passage I glimpsed something that made my breath catch, on the external stairs that spiraled up the lighthouse's exterior. Stairs that led to a platform I'd never noticed before. Wet footprints glistened. They began at the platform's edge, and descended halfway before disappearing, as if someone had started down, but vanished mid-step. I retrieved a flashlight from the keeper's quarters and climbed the internal stairs to check the building's blueprints. The plans, yellowed with age, showed no external platform. The stairs ended at the lens room, exactly as I'd observed. Yet when I returned outside, the platform remained visible, a dark shelf of metal extending from the lighthouse's wall. Standing below it, I called out, my voice quickly muffled by the fog. No response came, but the sensation of being watched intensified until it felt like a physical weight. The fog seemed to shift and breathe around me, creating the suggestion of shapes that vanished when I turned toward them. The footprints on the stairs were still wet. I spent the night huddled in the keeper's quarters, listening to the foghorn's relentless confession. It spoke of the embezzlement charges that had destroyed my career, the bankruptcy that had cost me my home, the substance abuse that had driven away the few friends who'd initially supported me. But gradually, the messages began describing events that hadn't happened yet. Conversations with investigators who would arrive next week. Questions they would ask about discrepancies in the lighthouse's maintenance logs. Evidence they would find hidden in the automated control room. Evidence that would finally prove what everyone had suspected about Boston. Evidence I had no memory of hiding. Dawn brought no relief. The fog had thickened overnight, reducing visibility to mere feet. The lighthouse beam continued its impossible rotation, casting eerie shadows through the mist. And the footprints had multiplied. They covered the entire platform now. overlapping in chaotic patterns that suggested multiple visitors, or perhaps the same visitor making multiple trips. Some led to the platform's edge and simply stopped, as if their maker had stepped off into empty air. Others appeared mid-stair, beginning from nothing. I climbed the internal stairs to the lens room, hoping to understand how the beacon was operating without power. The machinery sat cold and dead, its massive lens reflecting my pale face in distorted fragments. But when I looked out through the glass, I could see the beam itself, a solid shaft of light piercing the fog. The light wasn't coming from the lens room. It was coming from the platform that shouldn't exist, the platform whose wet footprints led nowhere. Pressing my face against the glass, I tried to see the platform directly, but the lighthouse's curvature blocked my view. I would have to go outside again, climb the external stairs, confront whatever was waiting there. The fog pressed against the windows like living things seeking entry. The foghorn continued its mechanical recitation, now spelling out my own name over and over. A summons, an accusation, an invitation. I descended the stairs slowly, each step echoing in the lighthouse's hollow core. The keeper's quarters felt different now, smaller somehow, as if the walls had moved closer during the night. My reflection in the mirror looked stranger, thinner, with eyes that seemed to belong to someone else. The external door opened with a groan that the fog immediately swallowed. The stairs stretched upward, their metal treads slick with moisture that might have been condensation, or might have been something else entirely. Each step brought me closer to the impossible platform, closer to answers I wasn't sure I wanted to find. Halfway up, I stopped. The footprints here were fresh, still glistening, but they weren't quite human. The proportions were wrong, the toes too long, the arch too pronounced. They looked like the prints of someone who'd spent too long in water, whose feet had adapted to a different environment entirely. The platform materialized above me, solid and real, despite its absence from any blueprint. A figure stood at its edge, outlined against the fog-diffused light that emanated from nowhere. It didn't turn as I approached, didn't acknowledge my presence, but I could see its profile clearly enough to recognize the shape of my own face. The figure was me, but somehow more solid, more real than I felt. It wore the clothes I'd lost in the bankruptcy proceedings, stood with the confidence I'd possessed before the trial. Its lips moved in silent conversation with the fog, and I realized the foghorn messages weren't being sent from the automated control room. They were coming from this other version of myself, the one who stood on a platform that didn't exist, confessing secrets to an audience of mist and shadows. I tried to call out, but my voice had no substance. The fog seemed to absorb the sound before it could travel. Instead, I climbed the final steps, each one requiring tremendous effort, as if I were ascending through water. When I reached the platform, the other figure turned. Its face was mine, but unmarked by the stress and guilt that had carved lines around my eyes. It smiled with the warmth I'd forgotten I'd once possessed. "You always wondered what really happened that night in Boston," it said, though its lips didn't move. The voice seemed to come from the fog itself. "Whether you actually took the money or if you just convinced yourself you hadn't to make the guilt bearable." The lighthouse beam swept between us, and in its passage, I saw other platforms extending from the lighthouse's walls. Other versions of myself stood on each one, representing different choices, different outcomes. Some wore prison uniforms. Others stood in business suits, successful and unmarked by scandal. One held a bottle that caught the light like a promise of oblivion. "The fog knows," the figure continued. "It's been collecting versions of you every time you've wondered, what if? Every time you've questioned your own memory, created another possibility to explore." I looked down at my hands. They were becoming translucent, the fog showing through my skin like gray veins. Below, on the rocky shore, more footprints appeared in the sand. But these led into the water, not out of it. The lighthouse continued its rotation, its impossible beam illuminating platforms that stretched in all directions, each supporting a different version of the choices I'd made or failed to make. The foghorn spelled out confessions that belonged to all of us and none of us, secrets that existed in the space between truth and self-deception. As the fog thickened, I understood that I was becoming another signal for the next keeper to decode, another message about guilt and possibility transmitted through the mechanical voice of the lighthouse. The platform beneath my feet felt increasingly insubstantial, like standing on crystallized doubt. The harbor master would find the lighthouse empty when he arrived for the monthly supply run. The keeper's quarters would show signs of recent occupation: unmade bed, half-finished coffee, maintenance log entries that stopped mid-sentence. But no trace of the man who'd accepted the position so desperately. The official report would cite medical emergency, probably a heart attack or stroke brought on by isolation and stress. They would note the keeper's history of legal troubles, his deteriorated mental state following the trial. Another casualty of modern life's pressures, they would say. They would never mention the platform that appeared in no blueprints, the footprints that led from sea to shore and back again, or the way the fog seemed to linger around the lighthouse even on clear days. These details would be overlooked, dismissed as irrelevant to the straightforward tragedy of a man who'd simply disappeared. But during the next major fog bank, the new keeper would hear the foghorn spelling out messages that seemed impossibly personal. They would see lights where no lights should shine, find evidence of visitors where no visitors could have come. They would climb stairs that led to platforms that shouldn't exist, seeking answers to questions they'd never asked aloud. And gradually, they would understand that the lighthouse collected more than just maritime vessels seeking safe harbor. It gathered the lost, the guilty, the uncertain, anyone whose reality had become too heavy to carry alone. The fog would offer them a choice, as it had offered me: remain trapped in a single version of themselves, weighted down by unchangeable history, or dissolve into possibility, becoming part of the vast gray space where all outcomes existed simultaneously. I had made my choice, though I could no longer remember the moment of decision. Perhaps choice itself was an illusion, and the fog simply claimed those who had already begun to doubt their own substance. The lighthouse beam continued its eternal rotation, and somewhere in the fog, another version of myself stood on another platform, telling a different story about what happened that night in Boston. In that version, perhaps I was innocent. Perhaps I was guilty. Perhaps guilt and innocence were just different frequencies on the same signal, transmitted endlessly through the gray static of memory and regret. The foghorn sounded again, spelling out a name I almost recognized as my own.